Hi everyone, welcome along to the Paper 3 live stream. Thank you very much for those of you that are joining. Also, thank you guys for those that have submitted questions via email or Instagram or any other platform. I appreciate your questions. I will try and get through as much as I can in a second. Everyone, welcome along to the Paper 3 live stream. Thank you very much for my thing here. No, here we go. Right, so there's a couple of things that I want to get through today. One of the questions, just to clarify from the outset, I have people messaging me going, oh, XYZ topic has come up in papers 1 and paper 2. Does that mean they can't examine it in paper 3? The short answer is no. It obviously decreases the probability that it does come up, but that does not mean it eliminates it. As a good example, June 2019, the 25 marker in paper 1 was about collusion, basically game theory within that. And then the 2019 paper 3 had a 12 marker on game theory. So it's not a good idea to eliminate or to stop revising topics that you have already kind of seen in previous papers, just as a little word of caution. But of course, yes, the chances of it being like a bigger question are slightly reduced. Okay, I want to basically go through something from the outset to just show you a type of question that I regard as a little bit more challenging from a past paper, and then we'll work our way through made up questions as well as like certain topics that I want to make sure that you're prepared for in the event that that topic comes up in the exam. Our starting point is, if I just share my screen, is I want to talk about a theory that is not officially, when I say not on your spec, it means that they're not allowed to ask a question specifically about this concept, but it is something that you can use as part of your answer and it will always be on the mark scheme. Now, I'm not a massive fan of the theory, but the reason why I think it's important for you guys to know what this is and understand it is because it can be a bit of a get out of jail free card for specific questions. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So this theory, I'm sure you guys have covered it in school, is basically the king demand curve, yeah? The king demand curve is something that basically will tick off the box of game theory. So if you get a question of use game theory in your answer, king demand curve is an example of game theory. Another one is prisoner's dilemma, which I may do later on, but I have done it in the paper 1 session as well. Right, let's talk about what the king demand curve illustrates, and then I'll show you an example of a question where it makes a lot of sense to use it. So what we have is this, quantity and then cost/revenue, yeah? This is looking at it from the perspective of an oligopoly. So one of the key characteristics, as you know, of an oligopoly is that firms are interdependent. In other words, the actions of, let's say, one supermarket necessarily impacts the other supermarkets in that industry. Right. So let's say this is the perspective of Tesco. And we assume initially, pick a random point, call it A. Let's assume that initially Tesco are operating at that level, producing this quantity, and the price they are currently charging is this, PE. So what the theory says is as follows. It goes, okay, in the scenario where Tesco decided to raise their price above that price PE, what would happen? Well, if Tesco raised their price, the assumption is the other supermarkets like Asda and Sainsbury's decide to keep their prices unchanged because they know that if they keep their prices unchanged, a lot of the customers that were shopping at Tesco now come over to Sainsbury's or Asda. Therefore, from Tesco's perspective, raising your price, if a lot of your customers now switch over, that means the demand for your services above PE are very, very elastic. So I can show that with a very elastic demand curve like that, yeah? Therefore, a very small increase in the price from PE to P1, can you see that that results in a really significant decrease in demand, or a better way of saying that is a more than proportionate decrease in demand. Doesn't therefore make sense for Tesco to do this. Scenario number 2, Tesco decides to cut their price. What will all the other supermarkets do? Well, the other supermarkets don't want to lose market share to Tesco. Therefore, they respond by also cutting their prices. Therefore, although you might get a few more customers, people might buy a few more, let's say, groceries, there's not going to be a dramatic increase in demand because no one really is standing out now. Therefore, the demand is very, very, very inelastic below price PE. An example is if the price is all the way down here at P2, well, now it hits the demand curve over there. It's a less than proportionate increase in demand. If this is the AR curve, demand, yeah? I don't need you guys to know it beyond this. I know that you've probably seen it at school with like an MR curve and like MC curves, etc. It will suffice and it will do more than enough of a job as long as we explain it, and we will in a second. So in a nutshell, by the way, what this theory is going to show us is that it does not make sense to compete through prices. It doesn't make sense for an oligopolist to raise their price, but it doesn't make sense for them to also reduce their price. Right, with that in mind, I want to jump straight into what I regard as the hardest 12 marker they have set so far in paper 3, and that was in June 2019. So let's open the June 2019 paper and have a look. I'm sure some of you guys have seen this before. And I want to kind of dissect this question with you and show you how you could apply your theoretical knowledge to answer a question like this. Question C says the following. In extract A, lines 15 to 16, it was suggested that some firms may respond to the advertising ban by cutting the prices of their products. Using game theory, and the information provided in Figure 1 and Extract A discuss the effects on firms, in bold, on firms of cutting prices in an oligopolistic market. Right, there's a lot going on, right? Bear in mind, the data is relatively useful. It's not crazily helpful for this one, which makes it even more challenging. In a nutshell, what's happened here, those of you that have not read this, is that in the kind of crisps and high sugar, high salt food market, the government have imposed an advertising ban for adverts targeting children. Yeah. So companies like Walker's have responded, according to the extract, by actually cutting their prices, which makes this extra awkward because typically when we deal with oligopolies, we're dealing with prices typically going up. It might be because they're forming a cartel, collusion, etc. So there's two things that I need to unpack here. One is, what is the impact of an advertising ban? And secondly, what is therefore the effect of them lowering their price? And part of that could be, why are they reducing their price? So let's think of this together. If you have an advertising ban, the genius point, the point that is so clever for you to have said is to go, this makes the market more contestable. Because if you guys remember from contestability is where barriers to entry and exit are low, and there are low sunk costs. Well, advertising is a major sunk cost. If you suddenly have an advertising ban where no firm is allowed to advertise, no one can gain an advantage over the other through like massive marketing budgets. Therefore, the market becomes more contestable. Another way of describing that is that the threat of entry has become more real. There's a genuine chance now that a new firm can enter the market and take market share away from the likes of Walker's. Okay, now that we've gone, all right, so the consequence of advertising bans is that the market becomes more contestable. What, could you argue then, are Walker's doing by cutting their prices? Hopefully, you guys are now saying to me that they are limit pricing, because the whole point of limit pricing is to try to deter firms from coming into your market, right? So then the topic sentence could be something like this. It could be one effect on, and I will specify, by the way, a firm to get application, on Walker's cutting their prices in response to an advertising ban is to preserve their market share. Yeah. Then I would explain the fact that the advertising ban makes the market more contestable as there are lower sunk costs. In response to the threat of entry becoming more real, Walker's may be adopting limit pricing. Let me quickly go through what limit pricing is, because if you guys are lucky and get a 12 marker, maybe an 8 marker, but hopefully a 12 marker on pricing and non-pricing strategies, this is a really good pricing strategy to do. I did this in the theme in the paper 1 live stream, but just really quickly to just readdress. Limit pricing in a nutshell is basically where a firm is able to, ignore my diagram for a second, is able to maximize profits in the short run, but they purposely choose not to. They either make normal profit or they make small amounts of supernormal profit. The key thing to understand about this is that in Walker's case, what they're going to do is they're going to set their price below the average cost of potential entrants to the market. To clarify, not below their average cost, below the average cost of firms considering entering the market. Now, how can they do this? Well, they can do this by tapping into the huge economies of scale that they have. So if I draw it like this, and I go, okay, do you guys agree that Walker's are a massive, massive company? In the extract, it shows they have like over 50% of the market. So they're a legal monopoly. When they are producing output, they're operating somewhere over here where their quantity is extremely high. And therefore, their average cost is all the way down there. So their AC is way, way lower. They're able to bulk buy, for example, I'd always give an example, by the way. Let's say they can bulk buy on the potatoes. So imagine hypothetically, the average cost for Walker's is, let's say, £1. They could therefore charge a price of £1.20 and continue to make supernormal profits, but it's a very low price. Okay. A new firm wanting to enter that market, do you agree that they're not going to have anywhere near as much market share as Walker's? They would therefore be operating somewhere over here at Q2. They cannot bulk buy potatoes in the same volume as Walker's can, therefore their cost is all the way up there. Let's assume that this firm's cost then, I'm going to just do that here, their average cost is, let's say, £2.50. Okay. Can they charge the same price that Walker's are charging for their packet of crisps? Well, of course not. If Walker's basically deter, hopefully, them from entering the market. Yeah? Am I back? I think I got disconnected. Hopefully we're back. Okay, right. There's a few issues with the internet in the office today, so hopefully it's resolving. If it does, by the way, if for any reason kick us out, I will go back in again. I don't know if it cut off. If it did, can I just quickly go through it again in the event that it did? So essentially, I said Walker's would operate at Q1, whereby their average cost would be much lower. They'll be operating basically at C1. Their average cost then of £1 allows them to charge a really low price of £1.20, whereas a new firm entering the market cannot tap into the same level of economies of scale. So their average cost is all the way at £2.50. The key word to describe what Walkers or any firm adopting limit pricing will be doing is this word. They are trying to deter firms from entering. They don't want firms to enter this market. They want to put them off because they go, look, you can't compete with us on a price basis. In the long run, once the threat of entry has faded, once, for example, Walkers have developed really strong brand loyalty, once the people are used to buying Walkers or they continue to buy at the low price, what can Walkers now do? Now they can raise their price. And they don't need to worry about the fact that their prices, they still will dominate the market. Firms won't be able to enter that market. That is your first analysis, and that is the analysis, by the way, for that question in terms of Walkers. Yeah. So that's number one. Evaluation. And bear in mind, by the way, for this question, I would do one analysis and one evaluation. One detailed analysis and one detailed evaluation should suffice to get you the 12 marks. At most, it will dock you 1 or 2 marks. It shouldn't, by the way. I asked one of the examiners at Edexcel to make sure that this was the case. If you do one developed analysis and one developed evaluation, unless it explicitly asks for 2 reasons, which I don't think I've ever seen for a 12 marker, by the way, but unless it says it explicitly, 1 and 1 will suffice. So I prefer you guys to do that. Okay, evaluation. Now, bear in mind, the question explicitly says use game theory in your answer, which makes it more challenging. Because game theory, normally I think of it as like prisoner's dilemma, how collusive agreements end up breaking up and firms stop basically colluding. But the problem is they're not lowering their prices here. They are raising their prices. Hence, I now take out my get out of jail free card and I draw this. I talk about the king demand curve because it satisfies the condition of game theory and it actually answers the question pretty well as well, because now it will say is, look, game theory illustrates that if they were to reduce their price, other firms, such as, so if we quickly look at the data, I think the company was called KP. Here we go. Yeah, so if you look at the big firms, KP of 22.7%. All right, what will KP do? Firms are interdependent. Therefore, if Walkers cut their prices realistically, so will KP and Taito, I don't know what they're called, right? Those guys. Therefore, is there going to be actually a dramatic increase in demand for Walkers? Not at all. If anything, actually, they're going to see a decrease in their revenue and therefore a decrease potentially in their profits. It might backfire, basically. Clear? That is how you'd answer a question like that and satisfy the condition of game theory, as well as making sure that you are obviously answering the question. It's a very, very difficult question, in my opinion, because with this, the prices were going down, which is not the norm when it comes to oligopolies. Okay, right. So let's tick that off from our list and go to the next question. Right, in the same data response, or the same paper. I don't know why they hated everyone that year, but they did. Let's do question 2C. Also not amazing. We will get to 25 markers in a second, by the way. We'll get to that. Oh. Right. The question says this. Discuss whether borrowers benefit from microfinance. Make reference to Mozambique in your answer. Okay, of course, you guys would read the data in advance. The key word to underline here, by the way, is borrowers. Borrowers are the people that are taking out loans through microfinance, yeah? And what I want to talk about very quickly before I answer this question is that with this paper, there are topics that you have been taught in macro where the question and the phrasing of the question might make more sense to address it through a micro lens. Totally fine, and vice versa. It's completely okay for you to do that. Obviously, in normal, like most of the time, a micro question you'll be answering through a micro lens. Like if you get a question about, let's say, taxes and the impact of indirect taxes, you're not really going to be dealing with it on a macro level unless you're doing it as a 25 mark, right? You're going to just do with it as like, oh, cost and revenue or like supply and demand. This is an example of a question that microfinance comes under macro in theme 4. However, because it's specifically the borrowers, it is not the macro economy. It's not the impact, for example, on, let's say, like the savings gap and things like that. You are going to have to basically, I recommend anyway, look at it through the lens of micro, the firm itself. And this is how we're going to basically address it. If firms were unable to access credit, they were unable to access loans through conventional means, are now given small loans via microfinance. What can they do with those loans? Well, logically, that firm is now able to basically use that money to invest into new capital, to invest into like innovating and producing like, innovative products. But I want to, if possible, draw a diagram. And so this is what we're going to do. Let's do it together. So if I show you guys the diagram I have in mind for this, wherever possible, especially in the 25 marker, and I'll get to this in a second, I want you to draw a cost and revenue diagram. I'm hoping you guys are lucky enough, because of the fact that they haven't asked it in paper 1, that you're going to get a 12, maybe an 8, I hope it's a 12, on assess the impact on, let's say, profitability of something happening, draw a cost and revenue diagram, because that hopefully means that you can save a lot of time and get full marks. Anyways, so what we have is as follows. We're going to start off with a firm just making supernormal profits. If you've not watched my video going through systematically how to draw these diagrams, you really need to watch it. But in a nutshell, step 1 is going to be MC. And then we're going to have AR equals D. Marginal revenue, as you know, is half the slope. Profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR, that's Q1. Your price is determined by going up to the demand curve, AR, that's P1. And let's make this firm make supernormal profit to start off with. AC, yeah? And there we go, C1. Always label the corners of the area. So the profit area initially is P1, AB, C1. Okay. Now, if they have loans that they can take out at, let's say, to invest into like new capital, what does that do to their costs of production? Well, their costs of production are going to go down. Is that fair? That you could make the case is a variable cost, right? So it's going to reduce their variable cost because it will decrease how much it costs them to produce each unit of the good that they produce. Therefore, now I can shift both MC and AC. You should always shift MC first. So let's shift MC. So that's MC2. Profit maximization occurs where MC is equal to MR. So here we are, Q2. And then I derive my price by going up over here. So the price should go down, P2. And then finally, I now shift the AC curve. And again, it's going to go down and it's going to hit the new MC curve at its lowest point, yeah? With cost and revenue curves, I want you to think of it as up and down in terms of shifts. It's just easier to understand it that way. So we're going to do something like that. AC2. I go up from my new quantity Q2 until I hit the AC curve, C2. And remember to label the area. So this is D and this is E. I purposely miss out C, by the way, because we have C's on the y-axis, yeah? Okay, right. There's quite a lot to basically say now. It's very easy to develop this from here because I describe the diagram. I go, a reduction in their costs causes MC and AC to fall. As a result, the price they charge for their products decreases from P1 to P2. Their output increases from Q1 to Q2, and their profits increase from area P1, ABC1 to P2, DE, C2, yeah? There you can develop it even more by saying these additional profits can be invested into the latest technology and into R&D. You can give an example of what they could invest into depending on what the extract's talking about, maybe like new capital as well, or they could use it to, I don't know, create an app or something. Like whatever the data says. I don't have a clue what the data will say, but just give an example of what they could do with the money. And then you go, as a result, dynamic efficiency will also rise. Yeah, cool. That is our analysis. Evaluation. Thing about paper 3 is the data usually is far more helpful than it is in papers 1 and 2. Not that it wasn't helpful in those papers, but especially for paper 3, there is a lot more data that you will have in that question, in the questions usually. So let's have a look. It's a very easy thing to look at. Well, this. Look at figure 3. The cost of microfinance loans in Mozambique. Right. The mean, just the average percentage rate, like interest rate, is like 75%. That is mental, right? In other words, the idea that this is going to benefit borrowers, you can very easily evaluate and go, however, given that figure 3 shows that the average annual percentage rate of interest on these loans is 75%. And in some cases, I mean, this is mental for me. There's one that's 200%. Wow, right? Is it realistic that A, they're going to pay it back, B, that they're going to generate a return that justifies that loan in the first place? Probably not. If anything, this is going to just increase their costs. And as a result, some of these firms may end up shutting down. It therefore does not benefit them. It is highly, highly kind of detrimental to them to take out these loans. It's probably better for them to just try to grow organically. One analysis, one evaluation, finito. Cool? Right. Let's go through something else. I know you guys are raising your hands and answering questions on Zoom, by the way. I will get to your questions in a second. I have quite a few things I just want to quickly address. Right. One of the things that has yet to be asked for a number of years, the last time it got asked was June 2018 in paper 3. And I hope you guys are lucky enough to get it this year. It hasn't come up paper 1, so it could come up, is assess pricing and non-pricing strategies to achieve, let's say, more revenue, more market share, more profits, whatever it is. Our first analysis would be limit pricing, as I explained earlier, right? So you can go, this is what they could do. They could deter entry, etc., etc. Let's evaluate limit pricing. And then I want to go through a non-pricing strategy and alternatives as well, depending on what the data says, yeah? So if I'm doing limit pricing as my analysis, what would be my evaluations? I think there are 2 really good evaluations. Number 1 is to say, well, just because you offer a lower price, that may not actually deter new firms from coming into the market. The logic is that firms can compete with each other on a quality basis as well as on a price basis. Therefore, if you're offering a lower price, as let's say Tesco, then other firms may be able to enter the market and offer better quality, and they would still be willing to switch to you. So it may not be a sufficient deterrent, if you like. That's 1. Number 2 is the extract, if it is about like supermarkets, could actually mention other firms that have entered the market. For example, in recent years, Amazon Fresh have entered the supermarket industry. Why? Because Amazon Fresh is so big from other operations and their other businesses, that they're able to overcome the barriers to entry. They're able to basically compete on a cost basis, even if they don't have the same market share as Tesco when it comes to the supermarket industry. Therefore, big players in the market may still be able to enter the market. That is limit pricing. Quick alternatives that you could go through in case they sometimes, I've never seen them do it for pricing and non-pricing, but you never know. Just as like in your paper 2, where the 25 marker said, apart from monetary policy, blah, blah, blah. They can, and they did that a lot in June 2019. It goes, apart from, so let's say it was like, apart from limit pricing, what other pricing strategies could you talk about? Well, you can now talk about predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is basically where you set your price so that below your average variable cost and you're purposely incurring losses. The purpose of that is that you as a big firm can absorb losses. Can the small firms in the market absorb losses? No, therefore the small firms are shoved out of the market. They shut down. Once they've left, you now raise the price. The evaluation to that is so easy, majorly illegal, like you're really not allowed to do this. And also it might not work because the small firms might actually have really strong brand loyalty. So that could be another pricing strategy. A third pricing strategy, just to cover all the bases, is that they might collude. The existing firms might decide it's a good idea to form a cartel, and they all raise their price. And because of the fact that they're operating as a cartel, meaning that basically behaving like they're a monopoly, demand will be very price inelastic. There's very little other choice. They're the big sellers in the market. Therefore, the increase in the price would lead to a less than proportionate decrease in demand, hence higher revenue for the firms, higher profits, and then you could talk about where they do the profits. Yeah. Evaluation to that, a really good one is prisoner's dilemma. The idea that actually cartels tend to break down. There is always an incentive for one of the firms to undercut other firms in the cartel to gain profits at their expense. There's also the incentive to whistleblow, because you think if I whistleblow, and I'm going to get all of this, like, you know, all of my rivals are going to get big fines and reputational damage. I'm not going to get touched. That's enough pricing strategies. The non-pricing strategy that I prefer you to do is advertising, because I think it's really straightforward and you can draw a diagram. If you do advertising, what I expect you to now do is you say that, you know, a successful advertising campaign is going to shift AR and MR outwards, demand basically. You shift it outwards, summarize the diagram. That is pretty much what you need to do here. The evaluation to that would be, however, there are significant sunk costs. A sunk cost is a cost that you cannot retrieve upon exit from a market. Therefore, if you have like, a massive budget for advertising campaign, there's no guarantee that it actually will result in a higher level of demand. It might not at all. That is a problem. Let's say, by the way, it actually said something evil like, apart from advertising, what could you do as a non-pricing strategy instead? I mean, there are loads of options. You've got things like loyalty cards and like improved quality of services, blah, blah, blah. I think the best one, though, is merge. You could also merge. That counts as the non-pricing strategy. They could merge with another firm in the same industry, horizontal integration, and you could talk about all the benefits of horizontal integration. In fact, by the way, if they're merging, you're drawing the same diagram that you would have drawn for advertising, which is AR and MR shifts out. Yeah. And then the evaluations for a merger could be something like, well, the CMA might block it. It could be that it results in diseconomies of scale. There might be cultural clashes between the firms. They might end up demerging, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Right. So hopefully that was covering the event that pricing and non-pricing strategies comes up as a 12 marker. That would be lovely. I would not mind that at all. Right. Can I make up a 12 marker? And then I promise we will do 25 markers in a second. I'm not trying to avoid it. It's just that I actually need you guys to understand something. A lot of people focus all their energy on the 25 markers, and I appreciate that because collectively it's worth 50% of the paper. The 5, 8s, and 12s, more often than not, typically are very straightforward, to the point where if you manage to get 5 out of 5, which you really should, 8 out of 8, and even if you got 10 out of 12, to get an A star, you genuinely need 17 now out of 25 marks in that section. That is really doable. That's very, very achievable. In the event that you got 5, 8, and 12, and again, if I look at, for example, June 2018, paper 3, you genuinely should be getting 5 out of 5, 8 out of 8, and 12 out of 12. Like, there's no excuse here. You could therefore get 15 out of 25. Not that I want you to get 15 out of 25, and you're still hitting an A star. Anyways, right. The 12 marker that I'd like to make up is as follows, is assess the impact on supermarkets' profits of an increase in monopsony power. Use a supply. Have I been disconnected again? I think I'm back. Right, sorry, I don't know why we keep getting, like, the internet keeps going in and out. Hopefully you guys are still with me. Right, so in case the question you didn't hear it, it was assess the impact of an increase in monopsony power on supermarkets' profits. Use a cost and revenue diagram in your answer. Right, when it does that, when it asks explicitly for a diagram, all I need you to do is simply just talk about what the impact will be show it on a diagram and summarize it in terms of profitability, and you're done. That gets you the 8 marks. So as a starting point, let's start by defining what a monopsony is. A monopsony is where there is a single or small group of powerful buyers. So the supermarket industry is a really good example of that. Now, if there is a higher degree of monopsony power, what does that mean? It means that Tesco and the other supermarkets are able to push down the price they pay for their products from, let's say, suppliers, farmers, etc. Right? What does that mean for Tesco? Well, from Tesco's perspective, it means that their variable costs are going down. Yeah. And I think actually my previous page, I drew this diagram, but let's quickly draw it again together. Yeah. So you're going to do this. You're going to go, okay, variable costs go down. Again, of course, you'll use the data. It'll probably say this somewhere in the data. You quote it and you go, okay, as a result, look at what happens. MC1, AR equals D, marginal revenue, MC equals MR is here, P1, P1. Okay, so we now draw the AC curve, AC. Right, so we should be able to get to this stage pretty comfortably. Yeah? If you don't, you need to practice. You need to make sure that you can. Yeah. And now it said that their variable costs are going down because they have a higher degree of monopsony power. So therefore, MC now falls. So something like that. MC2. Output goes up. Prices will go down. And finally, we're going to have average cost going down like here, AC2, and it goes across from there. Okay, C2, D, E. Right. Can you clearly see, based on my diagram, that obviously their profits are going up? You just summarize the diagram now. You basically say, look, an increase in monopsony power decreases variable cost for the supermarkets like Tesco. As a result, both MC and AC would fall. As can be seen in the diagram, the output or their price decreases from P1 to P2, their sales increase from Q1 to Q2, and importantly, their profits increase from area P1 AB C1 to P2 DE C2, 8 out of 8, like that, really fast. Yeah, that. Okay. What we have to do is evaluations now. Evaluations are essentially to question whether what you've just said happens, or to say, well, look, if your costs go up, but then maybe the demand decreases, then actually it might offset it. So can I give you guys a number of generic responses that, again, you will base it on the data. But in this instance over here, you can question the degree of monopsony power. You can go, well, actually, they may not be able to exert as much monopsony power over the big suppliers like Coca-Cola. Can Tesco dictate prices to Coca-Cola? Well, not really, because Coca-Cola are a massive multinational firm and they can fight back. So therefore, you may not actually see this happening to Tesco. Similarly, the CMA might intervene and limit the degree of monopsony power, and therefore this might just be temporary. They might not be allowed to kind of abuse their power. Number 3, the suppliers themselves might merge. If they merge with one another, that again limits the degree of monopsony power, because now they're a bigger firm, so they can kind of stand up for themselves a little bit more. Things like that. Alternatively, by the way, I could have also gone down the path of saying, okay, although costs have fallen in terms of monopsony power being high, maybe demand is falling. For example, Tesco, their demand might be decreasing due to online shopping and more people buying things from like Ocado. It might be that they're decreasing demand, or the demand is shifting inwards because of the fact that there's a cost of living crisis right now. So people might be switching to like the cheaper, low budget supermarkets like Lidl and Aldi, etc. Basically, just find a reason as to why profitability might not necessarily be going up. That's it. Yeah. Cool. Really quickly, before I go and do another question on monopsony, if they ask about, as they did in June 2017, the impact on a cost and revenue diagram from the perspective of a firm with regards to the national living wage. Bear in mind, the national living wage used to be for people above the age of 25. Very recently, it got changed so that it's applicable to anyone above the age of 23. Doesn't change anything for us, really. But if the question was, what is the impact on profitability of the living wage being extended to 23-year-olds? Okay, you're now going to go higher costs for firms because they have to pay more people the living wage. Variable costs therefore go up. You're going to now draw MC and AC up. Summarize the diagram. Talk about profits going down. You could even talk about some firms may even have to shut down. Don't need to, but you could, right? And then you evaluate. And now the evaluation in that instance would be, well, actually, they might be able to just switch to workers below the age of 23. Especially if you're on minimum wage or living wage, realistically, the skills required are a bit more limited. So you can probably switch to like younger workers, like let's say like baristas at, I was going to say supermarkets, at cafes, right? They could just get younger workers to do it. They could even potentially like switch to capital machinery, like self-checkout machines in supermarkets. Therefore, the impact may not be anywhere near the level we described in the analysis in terms of profitability. You can also say that a higher wage may increase worker productivity because there's a greater opportunity cost now of losing your job. So if you get paid a higher salary, let's say you were being paid before £8 an hour, and then suddenly I increase your wages, so you're being paid £12 an hour, do you agree that you're more likely to take your job a bit more seriously? You're going to hit targets more frequently because you're worried about the prospect of losing your job because the opportunity cost is higher. There's a bigger opportunity cost to losing your job. Therefore, actually, your cost for the firm might be going down rather than up. Generic evaluations, but there'll be data to support it, and therefore it can become a very, very good point. Yeah? Okay, I just want to, partly because Monopsony has yet to come up, and I'm not saying it will come up, I'm not predicting in any way, but let's say the question could be specific about, there are 3 players when it comes to Monopsony. One is the supermarket, which we just did, yeah? And I analyzed it and evaluated it. But it could say the impact on consumers, so let's do that. And it could also be the suppliers. Okay, the supermarket is this. You draw this diagram and you explain that their profitability will go up. You could evaluate it by talking about the CMA might intervene and actually stop this from happening, so maybe they don't get actually much more supernormal profits. Or it could be that the suppliers merge and limit the extent of monopsony power, or they can't actually do this to the big suppliers. Any of those, brilliant. From the perspective of a consumer, what has happened to the prices that we pay when we go to supermarkets based on this diagram? Well, can you see that the prices have gone down? Therefore, that is the paragraph about consumer, is that monopsony power may benefit consumers as they receive lower prices. Draw the diagram, you explain the diagram, variable costs are going down for the supermarket. They could pass some of this over to us in the form of lower prices, and therefore you can say allocative efficiency will therefore go up. Cool, let's evaluate it. The supermarket industry, though, do you agree is an oligopoly? Is there any guarantee that we're actually going to receive lower prices because they have a higher degree of monopsony power? Well, no, not at all. If anything, they might just form a cartel whereby they all agree to fix their prices really high or keep their prices as they are and not reduce them because they would gain more profits. But we don't really gain anything as consumers then. We might end up even having to pay higher prices, not lower prices. That. Last player, and I'll move on from monopsony, is the suppliers. Suppliers are basically the farmers, the person who basically sells their product to Tesco. From the supplier's perspective, a higher degree of monopsony power is likely to be really bad for them. It's likely to result in profits going down, and it's likely to result in potentially them shutting down. You can draw a diagram here, by the way, especially if obviously asked for a diagram, whereby if there's a high degree of monopsony power, that one of the reasons why is because it could be that there are loads and loads of sellers in the market. There are loads of farmers. And if there are more and more farmers entering the market, do you agree there are loads of substitutes that the supermarkets can now basically choose between? So if I'm a Tesco and I come up to your farm and say, listen, I want it at this price. If there are 100 farms either side of you, do you agree that you practically have no choice but to accept that price? Because I could turn around and be like, I'll just go next door and get it from that farm instead. So the more suppliers there are, the more monopsony power the supermarkets can exert because they can kind of pit them against each other. Well, okay, if that's the case, from a diagrammatic perspective, do you know what's happening? AR and MR are shifting inwards. From your perspective as a supplier, you have less demand for your goods and services because of the fact that there are so many other alternatives that they could turn to. Yeah, that could be one diagram that you could do. Another, by the way, is the extract could say that the cost for the firm has gone up. Let's say, like, I don't know, their rent has gone up or anything like that. And you can draw a diagram where their costs going up and then explain the impact on that. Yeah. Okay. So basically you develop that by saying suppliers are likely to basically lose profits, or profits are going to go down, and also they could shut down. The evaluation, very straightforward. One, they could merge, and therefore it limits the degree of monopsony power, and it depends who the supplier is. So again, I went through this earlier. If they are Nestle, if they are Coca-Cola, this probably doesn't apply to them. They can fight back. They are not going to see a decrease in their profitability. Clear? Right. Let's do another question. Let me have a look at some of your Q&As. I have stuff lined up that I definitely want to do. Okay. Okay. Monopoly, economies, go back down to share that. Okay. A lot of you asking about the judgment, by the way. I'll do that at the end of the course. Yeah, like it's not the most important paragraph, but I will go through it. Okay, right. I will read some of these as soon as I can. Sorry, there's so many questions that are coming through. I will get back to you guys very soon. But first, let me address the topic that I think, honestly, like the amount of people that emailed me about this and in a frenzy and panic, the financial sector. Let's deal with the financial sector. I'm going to start off with what I regard as the worst or most difficult question that they could possibly ask about the financial sector. And then we'll work our way through other alternative questions, because it could also be an 8, it could be a 10, it could even be a 5 marker. So the question I'd like you guys to write down in your notes is as follows. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of market failure in the financial sector. Okay, so again, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of market failure in the financial sector. Right. Let's go. One of the things to flag up from the outset is that although I will go through points that are definitely theoretically sound, that will be on the mark scheme, it really depends to a large extent on the data. The financial sector is a fairly new topic. It was something that was introduced in the updated specification. It was not in the old spec. And that means that there is very little out there in the way of actual questions. They've asked it twice in big questions, like in terms of data response. June 2018, they had it, and I will go through this actually, because I do want to go through that question about the role of the financial sector in promoting economic development. And then June 2019, the 15 marker was about whether the government was basically correct to intervene and bail out the banks, okay? They have yet to ask about market failure in the financial sector in a big question, which means that it could come up on Monday, yeah? So how do you deal with this? Market failure in a nutshell is exactly as it is in theme 1. So you define market failure. Market failure is where the free market fails to allocate resources efficiently. Now, can I just quickly do some revision to make sure that you guys understand the different types of market failures that could occur? And then I will pick and choose the ones that I think work best for this question. Market failure could occur because, number one, of something called externalities, as I'm sure you know. Externalities are basically spillover effects. In this case, they are definitely going to be negative externalities in the sense that if a bank, for example, takes excessive risks and they go bankrupt, does it just impact the bank? Well, obviously not, because any company that had their money saved in that account has suddenly lost its money, and so that company might go bust. Any individual that had savings in that account would lose at least a percentage of their money. So all of this is really bad. That is therefore a type of market failure, because there's an externality that arises from the market failure in the financial sector. 1. 2, asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is the idea that one party in a transaction has more information than another party, and they can use that to their advantage. So in the banking sector, financial products have become increasingly complex. A great example of that is in the 2008 financial crash, or the build up to it, is CDOs. CDOs are fancy things that basically are, again, there's a video, by the way, that I highly recommend. I'll post it on the comments for on YouTube, on the YouTube channel when it goes live later. It's a video, it's not myself. It's an exceptional YouTube video to explain the financial crash, to explain what CDOs are. In a nutshell, it's made up of thousands and thousands of people's mortgages. But this complex kind of like product, many people, including banks, by the way, were buying it without fully understanding what they were buying, right? So there's that as an example of a market failure. 3, moral hazard. Moral hazard is the idea that if you, for example, bail out a bank, it becomes an expectation that they're going to get bailed out again. This is very much going to be part of the answer that we're going to go through in a second. Number 4 is bubbles, right? A bubble, in a nutshell, is where the value of an asset is higher than it really should be. So in a kind of very brief overview of the financial crisis, because bankers were generating huge amounts of bonuses from selling these CDOs, and these CDOs are made up of thousands upon thousands of people's mortgages, what they started to do is take crazy levels of risk, whereby they would give out loans to individuals, mortgages, without checking things like their credit history to check if actually this person has a track record of paying back loans. They wouldn't check things like income statements to see if they actually even have a job. They just turn around to you and go, hey, do you want a house? Do you want a house? Have a house, right? Now, the issue with that is if I draw a very basic supply and demand diagram, S1, D1. So let's assume this is the average house price in, let's say, the UK, yeah? Where average house price is P1 and the number of houses that are sold in the UK are Q1. Okay. Now, the issue is that suddenly, if people who are not really part of the market, subprime mortgage basically, who would not normally be given a mortgage are now part of the market, they suddenly can buy a house. That means demand for houses dramatically increases. And now the price of houses goes up to P2. This price is a bubble. This is a highly inflated price, and it's only there because they're taking really silly risks, not because this is what it normally would be in terms of people who really could afford to pay off these houses, yeah? So if it was just left to free market forces without the bankers basically taking on these stupid risks, the price would be P1. Right, bubbles, what happens to bubbles? Bubbles always burst, they pop, right? And then all the negative consequences that arise from basically a bubble bursting. Cool, let's deal with this question. Let's go through how you answer this and the points that I prefer you to do, but bear in mind, again, the data might be more useful, or it might be that there are easier points from the data that you could draw upon rather than this. Let's start with macro. I think that a question like this, because obviously this is a macro topic, it makes more sense to do macro first because you can develop it in a lot of detail. Number one, let me just go through the overarching point. The overarching point is that the banks are so strategically important to the UK economy that the government almost had no choice but to bail them out. They had to bail out these banks. But when they bailed them out, was it cheap or expensive to do so? It cost them billions upon billions of pounds. Again, there'll probably be data that you can reference when you explain this. What does that do to the UK's fiscal deficits? Well, the UK's fiscal deficit would skyrocket, and it did. What does it do to the UK's national debt as a percentage of GDP? Well, it caused the GDP, national debt as a percentage of GDP, to go up from approximately around 35% of GDP in 2007 to 60% in 2009. I can't emphasize enough, by the way, how significant an increase that is. And then you can create an exceptional chain of reasoning where you go, high debt to GDP ratio led to the UK having a downgrade on its credit rating. The UK used to have the top credit rating. The top credit rating is basically AAA. You write it like this, 3 A's, yeah? Where like essentially that indicates to investors that you are like the safest of the safe. And you put your money there. If you buy that government's bonds, you're going to get your money back, yeah? Now the UK getting downgraded then, at least in theory, what does that do? Well, that would result in less people wanting to buy UK government bonds. Otherwise known, by the way, they're called gilts. Okay, so there'll be less demand for gilts, for UK bonds. If there's less demand for UK bonds, the price of each bond also goes down. But then remember, there's an inverse relationship between the price of bonds and the interest bonds pay out. If you're not clear on this, by the way, watch my video on quantitative easing. Yeah, the interest rates therefore go up. In other words, the cost of borrowing to the UK government now increases. It makes it more difficult for them to service their debts. And this was all as a byproduct of market failure in the financial sector. It's like an externality, basically. Yeah. Now, that in itself, by the way, is already a really good point. I think if you have the time, and we'll talk about timing at the end of this, but if you had the time, you could now extend it by also talking about how within that paragraph, because it's linked, there's a major moral hazard here. And the moral hazard is that the fact that they had to bail out the banks now know that they are too big to fail. They're too important to the economy. Do you agree that in the long run, this means that they are probably going to take on really high levels of risk again because they go, hey, it's fine. We're not really absorbing that risk. The government will bail us out. That is our first analysis in macro. So number one, the starting point would be something like this: is one macroeconomic effect of market failure in the financial sector is that it may spill over and negatively impact the government's cost of borrowing. Something like that, yeah? Or you could say one macroeconomic effect of market failure in the financial sector is that it may have negative implications in the bond market. Something like that, yeah? Then you basically go through the following. You go, look, the financial crisis of 2008 resulted in the government having to intervene and bail out several banks, such as RBS, Lloyds, Northern Rock, etc. Quote from the data. It will hopefully have some information about how much it is. If it doesn't have data, just say billions of pounds. Yeah. And this would have caused the fiscal deficit and national debt for the UK economy to skyrocket. Yeah. Again, if there's data, great. But you probably should remember that stat that I gave you earlier, which is between 2007 and 2009, it went up from about 35% of GDP to about 60%. By the way, it's about 100% right now. It's gone even higher since, yeah? Okay, then you talk about how high debt to GDP ratio resulted in the UK losing its AAA credit rating, and therefore the ramifications of that, which is that a downgrade in the UK's credit rating may have resulted in a decrease in demand for UK bonds. If there's a decrease in the demand for UK bonds, then the price of each bond also decreases, but there is a higher yield. Yield is a fancy way of saying interest rate. There is a higher interest rate that they now have to pay comparative to before. This makes it more difficult for the UK government to service future debts and therefore may limit their ability to grow the economy through expansionary fiscal policy. They don't have the money now. They basically have to find a way of cutting spending rather than increasing spending. Problem. Also, you can add, if you have the time, you now can say there's also a moral hazard here. Moral hazard being that given that the banks were bailed out, there is a moral hazard. This is because the banks now know that they are too big to fail. They're too strategically important to the UK economy, and therefore they may end up taking excessive risks again into the future. Yeah. So if I summarize that macro point in a nutshell, it would be credit rating is kind of the main thing to remember. Obviously, there are multiple chains of reasoning that come before it, but that is, in a nutshell, kind of the main thing. Cost of borrowing for UK gov up. Problem. Yeah. Okay. So that's the analysis. Right. Before I go through the evaluation, I want to go through and understand with you guys why debt itself is not necessarily a problem. And to do that, let's just go through a made-up example. So the way government bonds work is as follows. The government issue these things called a bond. A bond is essentially an IOU, whereby if I put money into the bond, in other words, I am lending money to the UK government, in return I get a piece of paper that says, I, the UK government, pledge that I'll pay you back the money that you just gave me, plus interest, right? And remember, there's an inverse relationship between the price of the bond and the interest that the bond pays out. Because if really safe countries issue bonds, loads of people want that bond. The price of the bond is really high, but the interest on the bond is very, very low. Okay, let's assume the UK government decided to issue £100 million worth of bonds. And let's say, to make our life easier, that the interest rate on that bond happened to be 2%. Let's say these are 10-year bonds. 10 years from now, how much does the government need to pay back in totality? In simple terms, they're going to have to pay back £102 million. Yeah, they pay back the initial £100 million of principal plus the £2 million of interest. Okay. Do you agree, though, the government, when they collect that £100 million, when they borrow it, they don't just sit there. They're going to obviously use that money and invest it into the economy. Okay. Government spending is a component of AD. AD will shift out. It's also an injection to the circular flow of income. So there'll be a positive multiplier effect, blah, 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 blah. Imagine I was able to track that £100 million of spending by the government over a 10-year period. And I could see exactly how much additional tax revenue was generated to the economy based on that investment. Let's say, for argument's sake, that it happened to be £105 million. Okay, what does the government now do? Well, do you agree they have to use, of the 105 million, 102 million to pay off this debt, but they're still left with an excess of £3 million. Debt then for an individual is very different to debt for a country. Debt for a country is not a problem, except if something happens. In this very simplistic example that I just made up, which is by far the most important number, by miles, the most important number is this number, the interest rate on the bond. Because if you weren't as safe an economy as the UK and people didn't trust you, then actually imagine the interest rate on the bond now, well, let's say was 6%, whereby they have to pay back £106 million. Well, in my made up example over here, they're no longer making £3 million of profit. They're actually making a £1 million loss on that batch of bonds. This is when it becomes a problem. In other words, this number has to remain low for us to not be worried. If that number, the interest rate on the bonds goes up, then there's a real genuine reason to be concerned. And I want to introduce you guys to a very important country for a question like this, and that country is Japan. Japan, you may be astonished to find out, has a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 200%. I think it's like 250 now after COVID, yeah? Pre-COVID, it was about 230. So like, I dread to even think about what it is now, yeah? Okay, now, Japan have a crazily high debt to GDP ratio, and yet you would make the case that it is not a cause for concern, that it's completely fine. They have a massive debt to GDP ratio. Do you know why? Because that implies that the interest rate on their bonds is still low. Now let's work backwards. If the interest rate on Japanese bonds is low, what does that tell me about the demand for Japanese bonds? Well, it would tell me the demand is high, because that would mean the price is high, and hence the yield, the interest rate is low. Out of interest, by the way, in case you want to know why, most of the bonds are bought by Japanese people. They understand that if they don't buy their government bonds, their economy would collapse and it would be disaster for them as well. There's like a culture, therefore, of them buying bonds. Anyways, not to go into all of that, the point I'm trying to make is this, is that actually the UK getting downgraded may not necessarily be such a problem. As long as the demand for UK government bonds remains high, then the price of each bond would remain high and the interest rate would therefore remain low. Hunky-dory, we're good, right? It does not matter then. That is a phenomenal evaluation, by the way, yeah? So you basically talk about how high debt to GDP ratio may not be a cause for concern. Sorry, my handwriting's gone all crazy. Ratio, not a concern. And then you're going to give the example of Japan, yeah? And when you're explaining this, you're basically going to talk about that as long as the demand for UK bonds remains high, in other words, as long as people continue to think the UK is safe, then the price of the bonds will remain high and the yield, the interest rate would remain low. They can therefore refinance their debts. In other words, they can issue new bonds to pay off the current batch that needs to be paid off and just continue in that way. As long as the interest rate is low, we are good. If you want to make a bit more sense of this, by the way, Unit 4, June 2016, has an extract about Italy and their debt being really high, and they talk about Japan in there, by the way, yeah? Have a read of that extract. It's very, very, very useful, yeah? I think it actually has a sentence about this, is if investors continue to believe that a country's debt can be stabilized at any given level of output, they will continue to refinance its debt or something like that. Yeah? Cool. Right. That's our first evaluation and analysis. But just alternative evaluations, by the way, in case you think that's a bit too taxing and difficult and that wasn't so clear. Again, data will be really helpful here, but you could talk about how actually the government embarked on policies after this to try and bring down the fiscal deficit and national debt. So from 2010, for basically 8-10 years, the UK government priority was to adopt what's called austerity. Austerity is fancy ways of saying cutting government spending and increasing taxation. Yeah. So if the government adopt austerity, maybe actually that can help to bring down the fiscal deficit and national debt. It did not, just, spoiler alert. But yeah, but you can use that as evaluation. The government might intervene and therefore manage to actually bring down the fiscal deficit and national debt. You could, by the way, also evaluate here by talking about the necessity of the government intervention, that it was fine. They needed to do it, it stimulated growth in the economy, but I don't think that one's the best one. Yeah, I think the one about Japan is probably the best. Let's deal with micro. To understand the micro implications, I need to go through a fairly complicated point. Now, bear in mind, there's a really easy point here. The really easy point is to talk about how the financial sector collapsing or the financial sector experiencing market failure could lead to a lot of people losing their jobs. It did. It led to a massive recession. Loads of people lost their jobs. Therefore, a lot less demand for goods and services. AR and MR shift inwards, and you can draw that. I don't mind you doing that. That works perfectly fine. Can I show you a fairly monstrous point though? An incredible point is to talk about this. Imagine that you bought a house in the middle of the bubble. You didn't realize that there was a market bubble. You didn't realize that house prices were heavily inflated. Most people wouldn't have. Let's say, hypothetically, I have bought a house for £500,000, okay? And let's say I put down a down payment of £100,000, and therefore I now have a mortgage of £400,000. So I put down £100,000 towards a property. The bank now buy the remainder on my behalf for £400,000, yeah? I now have to pay this back. This is my little mortgage over here. So here's my mortgage, okay? I pay this back on a monthly basis. The issue now is the bubble pops, it bursts. And suddenly I find myself in a house that I thought was worth £500,000, but it turns out my house, here's my little house, right? This is some amazing artwork going on over here, right? Here's my house, got weird windows, right? It turns out my house is only worth £100,000. Okay, there's a problem here because I suffer from something called negative equity. Negative equity is the idea that the asset that you're basically paying back the mortgage on is worth less than the mortgage amount. In other words, here, I'm paying a mortgage of £400,000, but the value of the house is only £100,000. I am in a bit of a pickle because if I decide to sell my house, let's say I decided to sell my house, I sell it for £100,000. Am I debt free? Not even close. I owe the bank or the mortgage lender £300,000. Uh-oh. Scenario number 2. I decide to default on my debt. I turn around and go to the bank and go, can't pay it. I don't want to pay it, right? Now, what happens in that scenario is the banks will now repossess your house. They now go and take ownership of the house. That in itself may not be the end of the world because you might be able to go and rent or something, but it means that you have on your record, your credit history will now show that you defaulted on a loan. Are you going to be able to access credit in the future, at least in the next couple of years? Realistically, no. If you wanted to now go and buy another house and you needed a mortgage to do it, who's going to lend to you having just defaulted on your debt? Basically, no one. And if they are going to lend to you, they're going to lend to you at crazy high interest rates. They are not going to trust you, basically. Yeah? Right. This already is a really good point. Let's take it one step further and make it a monster. The way we make it a monster is this, is imagine the UK, and that is so suited to your skill set. And they're offering you really good salary as well. Are you able to take up that job? Realistically, the answer is no, because you can't relocate to that part of the country because you're going to have a huge amount of debt that you owe the bank. In other words, labor now becomes geographically immobile. In other words, market failure in the financial sector spills over and causes market failure in the labor market. Now it's wow. Let's do it. So the analysis is as follows. Your analysis would be that one microeconomic effect of market failure in the financial sector is that it may spill over and lead to market failure in the labor market. Yeah, so let me just rub all of this out. What you would now explain is as follows. You would go, okay, in 2008, the 2009 financial crisis led to a bubble in the housing market, which eventually popped. As a result, many homeowners found themselves suffering from negative equity. The best way to describe negative equity, by the way, is to make up an example like I just did a second ago with made up numbers. Say an individual has a mortgage of £400,000 and they have, and the value of the asset falls to £100,000. This means that they are likely to, it means that if they sold their house, they would still be in debt of £300,000. And if they were to default on their debt, then this would negatively impact their ability to borrow money in the future and take out another mortgage. All of this means that if a job presented itself to that individual, they would struggle to relocate to that area and take up housing there because of the fact that they basically almost like prisoners within their house. Therefore, labor becomes geographically immobile. So number one is geographical immobility. Okay. I appreciate that it's fairly complicated, by the way, yeah? Can I give you an easier point as well? You can use the housing market bubble bursting to make a very simple point. And it's built on macro, by the way, completely fine. It's completely fine to build your points with the other thing, micro or macro, as long as the overarching point and what it goes back to is micro for micro paragraph and macro for the macro paragraph. Yeah. So here, when house prices collapsed, what do you know about from theme 2 that you could chuck in here to explain the impact of house prices falling? Well, house prices collapsing leads to a really significant negative wealth effect. Yeah. Asset prices were collapsing, not just for houses, by the way, especially houses, but also like stocks and shares and stuff like that. But anyways, in a nutshell, you could say, look, individuals will be suffering from a negative wealth effect. Therefore, consumer confidence will be really low. Consumer confidence being really, really low translates into less demand for goods and services. You draw AR and MR, you shift in AR and MR. You talk about firms collapsing, shutting down, profits are going down, they have less investment, blah, 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 blah. Cool? That would be a very easy analysis, by the way. And I actually don't mind you guys doing that one instead of this. Yeah. I'm kind of going through this just in case the data mentions something like this and you can kind of show off and go like, wow, look at me, right? Eval. The evaluation is not amazing. And again, to be honest with you, it depends on the data. But I think the evaluation is just to say that actually, since then, housing market has bounced back, that most people's assets have gone back to the prices pre-2008. So actually, it may not be that significant an issue anymore. You can also make the case that now geographical mobility of labor is not as big an issue because a lot of work can be conducted from home remotely. Therefore, it doesn't make a difference, even in that event where someone couldn't relocate. If it was like a services-based job where you can do it virtually online, they don't need to relocate. It's not that big a deal. Yeah. If I did the alternative analysis, by the way, where I did like, house prices falling, negative wealth effect, low confidence, AR and MR shifting in, the evaluation there is to talk about how the response by the central bank and the government may have offset this. For example, the Bank of England cut the base rate all the way down to 0.5%. It was 5.5% prior to the financial crash. It went down to 0.5%. That's a massive, massive cut. Well, if that means that people start to borrow more money and spend more, maybe then AR and MR will shift out again. If people feel a bit more confident about taking out loans, if people feel more confident about, firms invest more, blah, 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 you can then describe AR and MR may not necessarily fall. They might actually go back up to what they were. Cool. So that is the answer to that question. Right. I promise, go through your Q&As on Zoom in a second, but let me just go through a few more things on the financial sector. One of the things that you need to know, just in case, let's say it's an 8 marker or maybe a 5 marker, is the role of the financial sector. What are the different roles of the financial sector? Well, there are 5 roles of the financial sector that you need to know. So let's go through them one at a time. Number one, the first role of the financial sector is to facilitate savings. Okay, so it makes it easier for individuals to save their money. Okay, it's much easier to save it in a bank and rather than leaving it like underneath your pillow. Number 2 is it facilitates lending / borrowing. Right. Why? Because one of the roles of a bank is that you can go to the bank and take out a loan, whether that's as a business or an individual, and you can use that for investment purposes or whatever you might want to use it for. Number 3, the third role of a bank is to facilitate exchange. It makes it far easier to buy goods and services when you have a functional financial services sector. So if the question, for example, was about limitations to development using the financial sector, like why the financial sector not being developed enough has resulted in these countries lagging behind, well, one of the things you could talk about is that the number of transactions that take place is far lower because it's all dependent on you carrying cash. And that's obviously logistically a lot more challenging than, for example, carrying a card around and paying digitally. Yeah. So a limitation in developing countries might be that the volume of transactions, the amount of economic activity that takes place is lower compared to like a developed economy, which has a fully functioning financial sector. 4, they provide forward markets. Forward markets, hopefully you guys know, is basically where producers, normally farmers, but it doesn't have to be farmers, in advance agree to sell their commodity for a fixed price in the future, and they guarantee to receive that price regardless of what happens to the market price. Finally, number 5 is the provider market for equities. Equities is a fancy way of saying stocks and shares. It allows companies to list themselves on a stock exchange and therefore give away a percentage of their firm. In return, people who are buying it, why would they be buying it? They're hoping that they're going to make more profit and therefore they get dividends. Or it could be that the value of the asset increases. So let's say I own shares in, let's say, Tesla. If the value of Tesla stock prices increases, I could sell on and make profit that way. Cool. So those are some of the ways in which roles that banks play in an economy. But also remember, it can be mixed with another topic in terms of like how the financial sector can facilitate economic development, or why a lack of development in the financial sector could help explain why these countries are lagging behind. Okay, right. Let me show you guys a question that I think is quite hard, but we'll deal with it as if it's a 12 marker, because obviously you don't have a 25 marker anymore. And it shall be the following. Give me a second. It's the paper 2, June 2018. Let's have a look. June 2018. Here we go. Right. Okay. The question says this. Discuss the role of the financial sector in the growth and development of developing countries. Okay. If this comes up for you, it's going to be a 12, more likely than not. And so I only need you to know one analysis and one evaluation. I will do a second analysis. Even then, by the way, one evaluation developed in detail will get you the full mark. So even then, 2 and 1, fine. But 1 and 1 is also okay. Yeah, it's more than okay for this. So let's go through how to answer a question like this, because this is quite challenging. So how does the financial sector help promote growth and development? If I were doing this, I would sit in the exam and start doing the following plan. So what I do is the first thing I go is, okay, what is the role of the financial sector? And I would list these as I just did. Then what I can do is I go, okay, what are the limitations to growth and development in developing economies? What is making them lag behind? What is constraining their ability to grow and develop? Well, there are quite a few things that I should automatically know. Number 1 is savings gap. Okay, the Harrod-Domar model, that they don't save enough. Number 2, foreign exchange gap. Number 3, primary product dependency. They are overly reliant on exporting commodities, and therefore primary product dependency is an issue. Number 4, corruption. Number 5, poor infrastructure. You get the gist. There's enough there, yeah? Right. Then, very simple exercise is to go, okay, how do I match these? Well, do you agree the savings gap is obviously going to be resolved by facilitating savings? I'm also going to add this one in with it. But also, then I could talk about prime product dependency being resolved by forward markets. And now I have a plan. Yeah. Let's start with savings gap, because I think that's the better one. What you can say is this: one role or one way in which the financial sector can help promote economic growth and development is by facilitating savings. According to the Harrod-Domar model, many developing economies have very low savings rates, as their GDP per capita is also low. If you've got data, quote like at this point, yeah. As their GDP per capita is very low, and thus they have a very high marginal propensity to consume. Very fancy way of saying, for each additional unit of income that you earn, how much of it do you spend? Well, if you have very limited income, imagine you earn $5 a day. Do you agree that realistically, you're going to spend every single penny of it because you need to survive? You're going to spend it entirely on basic necessities. Therefore, the high marginal propensity to consume means the marginal propensity to save is very low. They don't save very much. This therefore deters banks from setting up in those countries. But in a nutshell, the lack of banks now translates into a lack of investment. Why? Because if there are no banks in place, it's hard for you as a firm to borrow money. There's hardly any banks, and they don't have very much in their accounts. Therefore, if you're going to borrow money, it's going to be a really high interest rates, or you might not be able to borrow any money at all. So you go, okay, if that is the case, then the financial sector can resolve this, because now if banks set up in these countries and they loan out money, basically lend money to businesses within the economy, what happens now? You could talk about how investment will rise. And now you are in very comfortable territory, hopefully, because you're going to say investment is a component of AD. AD therefore will shift out. Investment is also an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there will be a positive multiplier effect. You can now draw it, you can shift it. You can even talk about how the investment would increase productive capacity because the technology that they might invest into improves their productive capacity. And you can shift the LRAS curve outwards and say that economic development has occurred. That's a great analysis, by the way. Yeah, let's evaluate. The evaluations are not straightforward, but I think there's a really clever eval here. I think the really clever evaluation here is to go, well, the issue with the savings gap is not just because of the lack of banks. The lack of banks is because of something else. Why are they not setting up in these countries? It's because the GDP per capita is so low that actually most people don't have the money to save. It doesn't matter that you have a bank. If I put a bank in the middle of a slum in India, does that mean that suddenly there's going to be a higher level of savings? Probably not in any meaningful way. Therefore, actually, this doesn't resolve or address the root cause of the savings gap. Banks not being in those economies is not the root cause. The root cause is that people have too little income and therefore they don't have enough money to save. This does not therefore resolve it. That, by the way, gets you all 12 marks. One analysis, one evaluation, and there's a lot of detail there, yeah? Second analysis, just as an FYI for you, is forward markets for prime product dependency. Countries that are primary product dependent, they are reliant on exporting a particular commodity. And the issue is that commodity prices tend to look like this. So if I look at like time, price, they tend to do this. They're super volatile. Why are they so volatile? Because of the things like weather conditions that are out of their control, yeah? This makes it so difficult for the farmers or producers in these countries to plan ahead with any conviction. Forward markets can help address that issue because forward markets enables you to now in advance agree to sell your commodity for a fixed price and you're guaranteed to get that price regardless of what happens to the market price in the future. Yeah, this helps you to therefore, if you like, invest with a bit more confidence. And that would be second analysis. Yeah. Evaluation to that could potentially be that this is just one issue. There are wider issues for these economies. So for example, the education levels tend to be very low. And so limited education means that as a result, a lot of people might not even know how to use forward markets. They might not have the financial literacy to utilize forward markets, but also like still they are reliant on primary products. That's still a problem. So just because there's an element of certainty doesn't resolve the issue itself because they need to diversify. They need to have other industries like manufacturing and services to grow and develop their economies. Hopefully that is relatively clear. Yeah. Okay, right, let's go. What's next? That one's done. Financial sector's done. Okay. Can I make up a 25 marker? Let's do it. And then I'll look at your questions in a second. 25 marker says this: evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of tight monetary policy. So again, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of tight monetary policy. Okay. I promise I don't know. And so thank you for those of you, by the way, that were sending like, why can I describe it like fan mail via like Instagram or like email after paper 2. I'd like to take credit, but honestly, I said at the beginning of paper 2 and paper 1 as well, anyone that is basically trying to predict questions, I would not listen to. And I think it's a really silly thing to do, partly because of the fact that no one really knows unless they've actually seen the paper, but also because you should be preparing for every eventuality no matter what. So yes, I talked to you guys about like, competitiveness, and I did it as a 25. Yes, I did. What was it called? Market-orientated strategies, and it came up with 50. Yay, good stuff, right? So hopefully that helped you guys. I also did loads of other things that didn't come up, right? So I'm sure that what I'm doing today, loads of it won't come up, and hopefully some of it will come up. Maybe all of it will come up. I don't know, right? But please don't rely on any dictions, quote unquote. Having said that, right? I think the nature of the way they asked the 25 marker for you guys in paper 2, where it said, apart from monetary policy, how could you control inflation? Maybe there'll be an extract about monetary policy in this paper, hopefully, because monetary policy is quite nice. It's not an issue, right? Okay, what do I mean by tight monetary policy? Tight monetary policy or tight fiscal policy, any like policy that's described as tight. The opposite of tight policy is loose fiscal policy. Let me just go through how to like visualize and understand what that actually means so that you can always understand it in an exam. Loose policy, imagine you have purse strings, yeah? If they're loose, it means that you are spending freely, yeah? You're going, let's spend loads of money. Tight is tight purse strings, therefore you're being really tight with your money. You're restricting how much you spend. Okay, from a fiscal perspective, so I know our question is about monetary, but let's do fiscal. If it were loose fiscal policy, that means that the government are either spending more or they are taxing less so that people have more money and can spend in the economy. The opposite of that then is Tight fiscal policy. What is that? Obviously, it's just going to be, well, if you want to tighten purse strings, you cut back on your spending as the government and you raise taxation to restrict how much money people spend. Okay, that is in terms of fiscal policy. Let's deal with it then in terms of monetary policy. What does it mean in regards to monetary policy? In regards to monetary policy, well, tight policy is where I'm trying to restrict how much people spend in the economy. Should I therefore have a high interest rate or a low interest rate? If you're not sure, by the way, the easiest thing to do is just ask yourself one question. And that question is, if interest rates are high, are you more or less likely to save your money in a bank? The answer is that you're more likely to save your money. And if you're more likely to save your money, do you agree with spending less? Therefore, tight policy is high interest rates. Obviously then, loose monetary policy, low interest rates to encourage people to basically spend more in the economy. Okay, right. I could therefore rephrase this question to make your life easier by saying, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of low interest rates. Sorry, high interest rates, take it back, of high interest rates. Okay, let's plan it together. Let's go through what you basically can do for a question like this. There's a lot you can do, to be honest. Like, this is a nice question to get. Obviously, again, remember there is data, so try to base it on the data. You don't have to, by the way. You can get application marks through diagrams and obviously real world knowledge as well. But unlike papers 1 and 2, the 25 marker, the data is relevant to your answer. So it's a good idea to use it. Okay, I personally think that the macro is easier than the micro. Therefore, let's start with the macro. Yeah, always start, in my opinion, on the paragraph that you know you can develop in a lot of detail, like your stronger foot, to anchor into the minds of examiners that you are amazing. So not to say the rest of the essay needs to be like rubbish, but it's being read through the lens of, oh, wow, this person knows what they're talking about. This is amazing. There are a variety of different routes I can go down. But can I just explain, for monetary policy, by the way, you should always be looking at it through the perspective of aggregate demand and the components of AD. Components of AD are C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Yeah? I could do a paragraph about consumption. I could do a paragraph about investment. Government spending, by the way, is fiscal policy. You ignore it for the analysis for monetary policy, pretend it's not even there. Or I could do a paragraph about X minus M. The reason why I want you guys to plan your essays before you start executing them for the 25 markers is because sometimes when you're writing a plan down, you might realize that at certain points works better on a micro level than it does on a macro, and then switch it. You might realize that there's a better point that you could have done, and therefore you choose that, or a point that you feel more comfortable developing, and you go down with that route. Yeah, I am gonna basically do this. I'm going to do exports minus imports as my macro point. Allow me to take you through a little journey. Our starting point is to talk about a concept which hopefully all of you know, called hot money. Hot money. What is hot money? Hot money is simply investors around the world wanting to park their money in the bank accounts that give them the highest rate of return. Yeah. So if I'm a multimillionaire, I want to ensure that I'm putting my money in wherever I get the highest return. So hot money can either flow into an economy or it can flow out of an economy. Well, in this case, if interest rates in the UK are high, so high interest rates, IIR, yeah, hot money obviously is going to flow into the UK economy. People want to put their money in British bank accounts at the moment because interest rates in the UK are high. I can now show this on an exchange rate diagram. You need to know this. Exchange rates have yet to be asked, by the way, so that could also come up. We have here quantity of pounds. And over here, price of pounds in whatever currency. So let's say dollars, yeah? This is supply. This is demand, right? If you haven't watched, by the way, the paper 2 Q&A session, I highly recommend you do, because I went in depth about the exchange rates and how to, like, figure out different shifts in exchange rates and how to answer questions on it. I'm not going to do that today because I don't want to repeat everything, but definitely watch that if you didn't watch it. Okay, in this case here, hot money is going to flow into the economy. What does that mean? What shift? Supply or demand? Well, if more people want to put their money in British bank accounts, they need to buy pounds. Therefore, the demand for the pound shifts outwards, D2. And as a consequence of that, the price increases. A better word to describe that is the currency, or the pound, appreciates. The pound has just appreciated. And I obviously will draw this, by the way. This hopefully now gives you a trigger in your mind and you go, okay, I know exactly what I need to do from here. If a currency has appreciated, are you more or less internationally price competitive? The answer is less. You are less internationally price competitive because of the fact that now other currencies cannot buy as much of your currency. In other words, because you're less price competitive, you now say exports are likely to go down. 25 marker, I want depth. The way you get depth is by asking yourself a simple question. That simple question is why? Why is that thing happening? So exports are going to fall because other currencies such as the US dollar cannot buy as many pounds. Imports are likely to go up. Why? Because the pound can now buy more in the global market. The combination of falling exports and rising imports worsens the UK's current account deficit. It gets worse. Yeah. That, by the way, is very good. And that's very good detail. If you have the time, you can go one step further, go one layer forward. You go, X minus M is also a component of AD. Therefore, a worsening of the UK's current account deficit may cause AD to shift inwards. Imports are also a withdrawal, leakage, whatever you want to call it, from the circular flow of income. And so there would be a negative multiplier effect. You now describe what that is, and you can now simply draw a very basic diagram, such as the following. Let me just go on a new page. Back that page. We're going to have this real GDP, price level. You can also write real output, by the way. It's exactly the same thing. I mean, that is not the nicest LRAS curve. I apologize, but it will do. 81, Y1, P1. I shift 80 in once, and I'm going to shift it in twice. Why the second shift? I'm going to do it in a sec. Because of the negative multiplier effect. Oh, 83, sorry. Yeah. Number 3, P3. Summarize the diagram, and you have yourself an exceptional analysis, like exceptional. There's so many layers here. There's so many chains of reasoning that we've developed here. Let's evaluate it. Every single time a currency has appreciated or depreciated, revalued or devalued, and it's specifically the point being made is exports are rising and imports are falling, or imports or exports are falling and imports are rising, I want you to evaluate with our friend, Marshall Lerner, okay? The way I'd word it, the way you word it for this is something like this. However, for there to be a worsening of the UK's current account deficit following an appreciation of the pound, the Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied. This states that the average sum of the price elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than 1. Your exports and imports collectively need to be elastic. Otherwise, whatever you've just said in the analysis doesn't transpire. The opposite actually happens, yeah? Now, normally we draw the J curve. But here it's not a J because it's an appreciation. So let's figure out how to draw this. So I would do this straight away with the Marshall-Lerner condition, by the way. So you're going to go time, current account, this is positive, this is negative, yeah? Okay, well, where you start, whether it's positive or negative, depends on the country. So obviously the UK, we have a deficit to start off with. So let's start over here, okay? Where nothing has happened yet. The way to work out how to draw this diagram is to go to yourself, okay, whatever I've just said in the analysis, the opposite happens first. Whatever I've just said, the opposite happens first, and then what I said eventually will happen. Well, in our analysis, do you agree that we just said that because they're less price competitive, the current account deficit is going to get worse? Therefore, initially, it's going to get, it's the opposite of worse, better. It's going to get better. So it's going to go up, and then it's going to go down, yeah? That would be what the diagram looks like, and you can identify the exact moment where the appreciation happened over here. So you go appreciation of pound. Whoa. And now you can basically say the following. You go that the appreciation of the pound, or initially, or the curve illustrates that initially, the appreciation of the pound would improve the UK's current account deficit. This is because firms are likely to be tied into trade contracts and consumers tend to exhibit habitual behavior. As a result, the Marshall-Lerner condition is unlikely to be satisfied in the short run. In the long run, these contracts can be renegotiated, and provided the Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied, the UK's current account deficit will actually worsen in the long run. Clear? That is one half of your essay, and that is exceptional. Just because I want to cover as many bases as possible and make sure you guys are really comfortable, can I give you an alternative evaluation that's very easy as well? So an alternative evaluation instead of Marshall-Lerner and J-curve is this. To go, okay, do you agree that we just said if the currency has appreciated, your imports are cheaper? It doesn't require as many pounds to buy dollars and euros and yen, okay? Now, one of the assumptions you can always make, regardless of the country, is that firms import at least a percentage of their raw materials. At least some of their raw materials are imported. Therefore, what's happening to firms' costs of production? Well, the firm's costs of production will be falling if imports are cheaper, true? This on a macro scale is depicted by the SRAS curve shifting, and let's figure out which way. Real GDP, price level, SRAS, 1, AD, 1, Y1, P1. Okay, so essentially, if you have a decrease in your costs of production because your imports are now cheaper, your SRAS curve would shift outwards. And that is really good for two things. One, do you notice that we get economic growth? So the idea that economic growth falls that we said in the analysis might not happen. It might actually result in growth. And two, you get disinflation, which is really useful to the UK economy right now with inflation being as high as it is. Yeah. So that can be a good evaluation is to go, look, actually, the appreciation of the currency might be beneficial to the UK economy, and then evaluate by drawing the SRAS curve. Yeah. That would be the macro evaluation. Cool. Let's do micro. How do I deal with micro? Well, remember how I said often you can figure out these concepts, bring it back if possible to a cost and revenue diagram. I prefer you to bring it to cost and revenue wherever you can. Yeah. Well, if I bring it back to cost and revenue here, the way I will do that is to say, well, if interest rates are high, are people saving or are they spending? Well, they're more likely to be saving. If people are therefore saving and not spending, is there more or less demand for your goods and services? Less demand for your goods and services, therefore your profits are going to go down. How easy is that? So your micro point is going to be this, is higher interest rates equals higher savings equals lower spending equals less profits. And then we're going to draw. Let's draw it together really quickly. Quantity, cost slash revenue. Yeah, so here we go. We've got AR1 equals D1. MR1, excuse my horrible draw diagram, I'm just doing it really quickly. P1, okay. C1, and then we have this A here, B there, yeah? Okay. If AR and MR are shifting inwards, the easiest way to do that is just start at a lower point on the y-axis and just shift them basically parallel. So you can do something like this. That's AR2 equals D2. And where did I start? Start there. And MR is going to be like this. Yeah. MR2. Profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR, which is here. So their sales are going to go down. Their price, it hits the AR, the new AR. So much going on here. P2. And finally, I go up until I hit the cost, AC. So their cost is also going to be higher. Do you know why their costs are higher, by the way? Just out of interest. It's because they have less market share now. They're selling less output. So they're unable to tap into the same level of economies of scale. They used to operate here on the AC curve, but now they're operating at a higher point because their output is lower. They're not able to bulk buy as much. Yeah. So this is going to be D, and this is going to be E. And can you see clearly the profitability for this firm has gone down? You can go beyond that if you have time to basically say, okay, for some firms, actually, it might even result in them having to shut down if the AR shifts dramatically. Yeah, that is the analysis. The evaluation. So one of the things here, by the way, is that we could have talked about how they could also not be able to borrow as much money because interest rates are high, the cost of borrowing are high. I think a pretty decent evaluation. Again, I can't emphasize enough, a lot of it will be contingent on what's in the data. But if you look at the UK economy, up until recently, where interest rates have gone up, interest rates have been at record lows for a very long time. Since basically 2009, up until about 2021, 2020, maybe roughly, interest rates were practically at zero. They were so low. What might firms have therefore done in that period of time? Well, they probably would have invested. They probably would have borrowed money really cheaply and spent that on like capital machinery. And if that's the case, then actually their costs may start to be falling and that may offset the decrease in demand. Yes, there's potentially decreases in demand when there's, when there's high interest rates, but actually it may not be such a big issue for these firms because they already have ways of reducing their costs due to technological advancements and technology basically making it their life easier. Also, you could talk about like COVID. COVID has resulted in a culture of working from home or more people being open to working from home. So maybe they've reduced their office like rent. They don't have to pay rent for an office anymore. They basically can just now get everyone to work from home or reduce time, downscale the size. In other words, there are ways of combating this. Profitability does not necessarily need to go down. You could even talk about here, by the way, that it depends on the PED of the product. Some goods, realistically, the demand might not go down for. It might be a necessity. It might be like, oh, I need this good. I'm going to continue to basically buy that bid. Clear? That is that 25 marker. Hopefully that was useful. Right. Let me start working through your questions. And I do have other things that people have asked about that I want to go through as well, but let's, right, financial markets, Edexcel, please, answered. Yeah, hopefully that's answered. Okay, how would you write a final judgment paragraph on the micro and macro 25 marker? Okay, look, the judgment is just an attempt of you basically talking about overall your, like, whether you think the micro factor is more important or whether the microeconomic effects are bigger or more important than the macro factors, yeah? There isn't really a right answer as long as you're making it clear that you're trying to attempt at answering the question. So here, for example, when it comes to like monetary policy, if this was my question and I had it as a 25, my judgment would be something along the lines of, on the balance of evidence, the macroeconomic effects of interest rates, higher interest rates, are likely to be more profound than the microeconomic impacts. This is because interest rate changes affects every component of aggregate demand, whereas on an individual basis, firms may have ways of combating the issues associated with higher interest rates, something like that, right? Like, it depends on the question. I think they just want to see that you've made an attempt to do a judgment. You've attempted to basically close out. Don't say, by the way, in conclusion, don't say like to conclude. You're trying to essentially go, okay, this is more important than that. And maybe offer policy advice, if possible. You can say something like, as a result, the government should, or the central bank, should be wary about raising interest rates too much, as it may have significant negative macroeconomic implications. Something like that. Yeah? Does that kind of answer your question? So the judgment, just they want to see that you're making a genuine attempt at making a judgment. I really wouldn't lose sleep over the judgment. It really isn't that significant comparative to the rest of the essay. The rest of the essay is way more important. Yeah? Understand what spec, just understanding potential margin-only products. If I have time, I will go through that, but it's just like a bit unnecessary because you don't need to know margin-only products for Edexcel. Yeah. Can you just use the monopolies economies of scale diagram to show that? I don't know what that is. But yes, be careful. By the way, look, there's a bit of a debate in terms of drawing a diagram for economies of scale, because technically economies of scale is that you are on the same AC curve like this, but because you're producing a higher level of output, that brings down your costs like this. Yeah. I know that some of you, when I've read essays before, they talk about like economies of scale means that variable costs go down. And I understand you can make the justification and link it together, but technically that's not really economies of scale. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say draw like a shift in costs and like marginal and average costs when you're illustrating economies of scale. I would prefer you not to, yeah. But I think examiners typically will still be lenient enough to allow it and give credit, but it's not technically the correct diagram. Right, okay, I did judgment for that. Cool. Is it typically section A micro? Okay, it's a good question. I get this asked a lot. Is it typically that section A is micro and section B is macro? Not necessarily. And bear in mind, when we say micro macro, the 5, 8, and 12, I don't think I've ever seen a 5, 8, and 12 that are all micro topics or all macro topics. Yes, of course, naturally, one of them will have more weighting than the other in the sense that you could get 2 macro questions on 1 micro. But it's not in any way guaranteed, right? It's not set out that way. The only question where you need to do both micro and macro and dedicate 1 paragraph to each is a 25 marker. No other question. That's not to say, by the way, if there's a very clear point that you could use that is a macro analysis and maybe a micro evaluation, you can do that. It'll be on the mark scheme. The mark scheme normally for paper 3 has a lot of points. There's loads of things that you could talk about. Just obviously make sure that you're actually answering the question. Yeah. 25 marker referring to changes in oil prices. Okay, I will do my best. Let me write that on my list of things to do. Oil prices. Cool. Okay, the fracking one. Okay, cool. We'll do that in a sec. National wage. I'm not seeing power. Do you? Okay. Yeah, I actually think Monopsony is a 25 market come up, by the way. So we'll deal with that in a sec. What is Dutch disease? Okay. Dutch disease within primary product dependency. In fact, you know what? Let me answer that by answering another question. If you guys are lucky enough, you might get a 12 marker on primary product dependency. I don't think so, but you never know. Hopefully I'm wrong. Primary product dependency, in a nutshell, can be summarized in the following way. So developing economies, they have an over-reliance on exporting commodities, and they are primary products. Primary products are things that are naturally sourced from the earth, yeah? Now, the issue with primary products is there's a few issues. One, if I think I showed this to you guys earlier today. If I look at the price of a primary product over time, it tends to look like this. It is extremely volatile. Why? Because there are weather conditions and things that are out of my control that affect the price because of good and bad harvest. Yeah? Okay, the issue you have then is in countries like the Ivory Coast. where the vast majority of the population work in the agricultural sector, where 45% of their export earnings are from the sale of cocoa, when the price of a primary product plummets, this is a really big issue for them. The reason why it's such a big issue is because the PED for primary products tends to be very inelastic. Think about food, commodities. If the price of food fell, do you agree that your demand only goes up a tiny bit? It doesn't dramatically increase. Therefore, if prices are low, so if prices are going down, demand goes up only a tiny bit. So in other words, there's more of a decrease in the price than there is demand. What is therefore happening to total revenue? Total revenue for the firm is therefore dramatically falling. And if you're reliant on that particular sector as your main source of economic growth, main source of like tax revenue, main source of export earnings, this is a huge problem. When the price of the commodity plummets, loads of farmers are going to go out of business. The government tax revenue will dry up, meaning they don't have as much money to invest into like education and training, which could impact their HDI ranking and economic development, blah, 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 blah. This is a problem. The other alternative problem here, by the way, the other issue with the volatility of prices is when the price is all the way up here, can farmers massively scale up their production of a primary product? Well, the answer is no, because of the fact that primary products tend to be very inelastic in supply. The PES is a lot less than 1. Why? Because it takes a long time to grow the commodity, right? You could easily get an 8 marker, by the way, about this, where it talks about like the PES of a particular commodity. And it's usually that in the short run, it's very inelastic because it takes a long time to grow. It might be that you need more land available to actually grow the product on, et cetera, right? The issue then is this: if the price of the commodity shoots up there due to, let's say, an increase in demand, can the farmers actually generate substantially more profits? The answer is no, because they can't actually scale up production quickly. This volatility, the third issue with volatility, before I move on to the other stuff, the third issue with volatility is the fact that it makes it very difficult to plan ahead. People who are in this industry, like farmers in this industry, they lack any element of certainty. And so investment tends to be very, very low. It's deterring FDI, but also it's going to be low levels of investment. Okay. The evaluation to this, by the way, is either talk about forward markets and how they could help resolve this issue. You could talk about the use of a buffer stock scheme, possibly as like an alternative to like deal with this as well, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in my paper 2 course, the Q&A that I did last week, I think it was last week, I went through Prebish Singer. So that I don't repeat it, because I went through it in a lot of detail and gave like examples. Can you watch that back if you haven't watched that? Let me just address the issue of Dutch disease then. Dutch disease is a really, really straightforward concept. Countries that are primary product dependent, so let's say the Ivory Coast, do you agree if there is an increase in demand for their cocoa, the way that people outside of the Ivory Coast are going to buy cocoa from them is they need to buy their currency first. Hence, there's going to be an increase in the demand for that country's currency. Demand shifts out. But what does that do to the currency? Well, it causes it to appreciate. This, though, is detrimental to all of the other sectors across your economy, not agriculture, like tourism, like textiles, the services industry. Why? Because they're now all less price competitive. Those industries are going to struggle to compete on a global basis. Therefore, they end up collapsing and you become even more primary product dependent. In other words, it's like an externality. Because of the demand for your primary product, that's good for that sector at that moment in time, but then all the other sectors in the economy are struggling because of the fact that the price or the exchange rate has appreciated because of the extra demand for your commodity. Is that clear? That's Dutch disease. That's basically, in a nutshell, Dutch disease. Okay. By the way, the second evaluation, if you needed a second evaluation for a question like that, you could talk about how actually they have a comparative advantage in the production of primary product. It therefore makes sense for them to specialize in them because that's the best use of their resources. Yeah? Okay. Right. Do you need to know stats and industries? Not really, no. I mean, you would hopefully know it from paper 1 and paper 2 anyway, but bear in mind the data is relevant to the 25 marker, unlike papers 1 and 2. So you could just use their data, but it's a good idea to have a couple of things in mind that you could also use just in the event that, it will give you the option usually of like use other industries if you want to. Yeah. Can you draw the negative externality diagram between one financial sector? You can draw the negative externality diagram in the market fail in the financial sector. Yeah, I guess so. You could. You don't need to. Again, there's a common misconception that you have to have a diagram for a 25 marker. Most of the time you will. Most of the time I want you to do cost and revenue for for the micro and aggregate demand, aggregate supply for the macro. Yeah, I probably would prefer you to. But some questions, it doesn't need it. It depends on the question itself. So the one I went through with you guys for the financial sector, it didn't really have any obvious diagrams. Not one that clearly makes sense in my opinion. Yeah? Right. Increasingly. Okay. If the fiscal deficit, so hopefully I'm understanding this question. It says, if the fiscal deficit increased, led to a downgrade in the credit rating, making yields go higher, why did the base rate? Okay, cool. I understand. Let me clarify a massive misconception. The base rate is what the Bank of England set as an interest rate. Okay. That is not in any way the interest rates on the bonds that governments are issuing. They are totally different things. Yeah. In other words, the base rate in the UK after the financial crash was practically 0%. It was 0.5%. Okay. But if people were not trusting the UK government with their money, they were, but let's say they weren't, what would have happened is demand for UK bonds would have gone down. The price of UK bonds would have gone down, and the interest rates on the bonds, the yield would have gone up. They are not the same thing. Is that clear? So me putting money in a bank, I get a different interest rate than if I bought a government bond. And bear in mind, the interest rate on government bonds, they're changing on a like minute by minute basis. It depends on like people bid basically for the bonds. Is that super clear? They're not the same thing. Yes, it's interest, but it's a different like interest rate. Okay, right. Can you use the fact the government receives some of its money back after selling its stake? Yeah. So as an evaluation, by the way, of the government bailing out the banks, is that they actually did recoup some of their money. So they claim that they made back every penny on Lloyd's. Whether they did or not, I don't know. They made a loss on Northern Rock. They sold it to Virgin, but they did get their money back. So again, the data might have that, in which case that's a pretty decent evaluation by saying, look, the fiscal deficit and national debt went up because they bailed out the banks. And then you could evaluate it by going, but actually they made back a lot of their money. So is it that bad? Is it that big a deal? Yeah. If you do 12 market with one detailed analysis and without a graph, is that enough? Yes. Okay, cool. Yes. What was the evaluation for the negative equity within the housing market bubble? Okay, it was simply that house prices have since recovered. That even though house prices collapsed, actually people who held on to their houses and continued to pay their mortgage, their house prices have gone back up. And also the fact that geographical mobility of labor is not as big an issue nowadays because of remote working. You could just kind of work from home. You don't have to necessarily relocate. Yeah. For investment, can you draw AD, LRAS shifting in the same diagram? You can shift AD and LRAS. I don't mind. I mean, you don't need to. Probably just do LRAS, but you can. Yes. Yeah. Shall we draw that graph about volatile prices? No, that was just me explaining each. Don't need to draw that. Yeah. Right. Where are we? Sorry, I'm almost through most of the questions. I have other questions that I want to go through as well. Can you mention the Lewis model when talking about primary product dependency and education? Lack of education means people will be stuck in the primary sector, therefore preventing development. Yeah, you can. I guess so. The Lewis model. Can I actually go through the Lewis model? I think it's. I want to try to second guess, but it was asked last year as I believe a 5 marker in the 2022 paper 3. So it becomes a little bit less likely, not gonna lie, but it does mean that you could potentially use it as a point, right? The Lewis model, in a nutshell, argues that one of the reasons or one of the ways in which these countries can grow and develop is they need to industrialize. They need to essentially develop the manufacturing sector to have a chance of growing and developing. The theory says, look, there's an excess supply of labor in the agricultural sector, yeah, whereby there are too many farmers on the farms, right? There are just way too many farmers. Therefore, the marginal productivity of labor, right? Let's dissect that term. Marginal means one more unit. Productivity of labor is a fancy way of saying if you add one more farmer to the farm, how much output would that extra farmer produce? Well, the answer is practically nothing. You can even argue negative, by the way, based on the law of diminishing returns. So imagine we had a farm, and in that farm, there were 100 farmers. And let's say there's like no land left for you to grow your crops, and I add one more farmer. What's that farmer going to produce? Basically nothing, right? If anything, they're going to trample over the other people's seeds and not great, yeah? Therefore, according to the Lewis model, it makes complete sense to move the excess labor out of the agricultural sector and into manufacturing because the opportunity cost of doing it is non-existent. There is no opportunity cost. They're not producing anything anyway. By developing the manufacturing sector, you gain in 2 profound ways. 1, a strong manufacturing sector diversifies your economy so that you're less primary product dependent. So a shock in the agricultural sector now is not as problematic. And 2, a strong manufacturing sector is likely to attract FDI. And then you can go down the path of investment components of AD, all of that. It also might mean that people need to develop skills. So they're going to get trained up by the TNCs or trained up by the businesses that are setting up in the manufacturing sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah? Is that clear? Really quickly, actually, that reminds me of another not nice question that I want to go through with you guys. And it was again June 2019. I don't know what their problem was in June 2019, but they went in June 2019. Right. So June 2019, paper 3. Let me just open it again. Sorry. Is the following. There's an 8 marker that is not the prettiest. Right. For some reason this year, they just loved every question was like, apart from this, what else could you do? Yeah. Really quickly, actually, before I answer this one, I'm not going to answer. I just want to show you guys something really important in the event that you get something like this in your exam on Monday. The 8 marker that year caused so many problems for people because it said, apart from changes in indirect taxes and subsidies, examine 2 causes of income inequality within a developing economy such as the UK. Okay. The entirety of the data was literally about subsidies and indirect tax, the whole thing. So people were freaking out because they were like, what? How do I get application marks? How do I get application marks? And they spent a lot of time trying to find things that just weren't there. Application does not necessarily need to be directly from the data. Ideally, it is, and more often than not, it will be. I don't know what their problem was that year, but in that instance, it's okay. You can just say one cause of inequality within the UK is different access levels to education. For example, there is likely to be more people who have access to education within London, as there's more spending on education in London comparative to, I'm basing this by the way on the 22 paper 2, compared to like Rotherham. They use that like an example. That's your application. That's application. The second analysis could be, it depends on like maybe different levels of infrastructure and investment into infrastructure. Again, London tends to get a lot more investment in infrastructure compared to other parts, especially the north. And therefore, there's Labour's more geographically immobile in the north. People can't take up as higher paying job, blah, 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 right? My point then is none of that was in the data. Not a single part of that was in the data. Does not matter. You go and develop it and use your own application. It's okay. Don't get freaked out if they do that. Yeah. Right. Let's do. Where are we? Here we go. This one. Examine 2 reasons, apart from access to finance, why 90% of the manufacturing sector in Mozambique is made up of small enterprises. Right. First things first. Does anyone know what topic this actually is? So, this topic, in a nutshell, is basically why some firms remain small. Why it is that it's not dominated by like 1 big or 2 big firms. There are generic responses to this, some of which are micro, some of which are macro. No problem. Mix it up, all good. The data is actually relatively useful here, so you can definitely obviously use the data, just because we're a little bit short on time. I think one of the main things that you could talk about here is that they may have limited education levels. So the workforce are limited in terms of their skill set. If that is the case, then they are limited in terms of how much output they can produce, and the quality of their output means that they're not going to generate huge amounts of profit and therefore cannot grow to a point where they can become a massive firm. 1. Had it not said, by the way, access to finance, I definitely would have done that. Talk about like the lack of banking or financial sector. I can't do that here, but just in case it gets asked in a different way for you guys, it could be that you can't access credit. So you can't, for example, borrow money from banks because the banks aren't there, meaning that you can't invest. So your investment rate might be really low. Or you can't do that here. But just as an FYI, that is a really good analysis. The other one is infrastructure might be really bad. Because if the infrastructure is really bad, do you agree that it's very difficult for you to grow beyond a certain size because you can't sell your good across the whole country? You can't transport your raw materials very quickly. It's very costly. Everyone's kind of in the same predicament in the sense that there are limited growth opportunities because the infrastructure is really bad. Number 3, another one, I know obviously don't need 3 just to like cover it, is it might be that there are limited economies of scale. It might be the industry itself. There's not much in the way of bulk buying that you can do, or there's not much in the way of like, tapping into economies of scale. Probably isn't the case here, by the way, for the manufacturing sector. It's just that they're probably not able to because of their infrastructure. It is on the mark scheme, by the way, and it will always be valid. But if I give you guys a better example than that, is like the hairdressing industry. You could argue the hairdressing industry has very limited scope for growth for individual like hairdressers and barbers because there's not that much economies of scale. You're not going to be bulk buying that much, let's say, shampoo, are you? Right? Whereas like a supermarket, there's a huge economies of scale, hence why it will be dominated by just a handful of big firms that are able to take advantage of these massive, massive economies of scale. Yeah. The evaluations to these questions, by the way, the 8 markers are so lame, the evaluations. It could be things like, but actually this might be a temporary issue. The government in the extract mentioned is, going to invest into the infrastructure. TNCs might come in and actually they might dominate the market because they see there's a chance for them to become a monopoly. And therefore, actually, you might not end up with a manufacturing sector made up of small, teeny, tiny firms. It might be like one dominant player who comes into the market now, etc., etc., etc. Get the gist? Yeah? Okay, right. Let me have a read of some of your other questions. There are other things that I want to do as well, and I will do them as soon as I can. Does MR always have to go below Q? No, it doesn't. I just prefer it to, but you don't have to do that. Okay, labor market, I will do. Your teacher said the judgment isn't needed. Your teacher, with all due respect, is wrong. It's not as important as people make it out, but it is needed. Yeah, it is part of basically the 25 marker. It's only the 25 marker. You do not do it for 12. You don't do it for any other question. In the 25 marker, by the way, specifically Edexcel. I'm not talking about any other exam board. Edexcel, it is needed. Yeah, even if it's just 2 lines. If you didn't do it, by the way, paper 1 and paper 2, it's really not the end of the world. Like, as in, you can still be in the top level of evaluation. They might dock you a mark or 2. So what? Like, it's not the end of the world. Yeah, so don't worry too much. In a cost and revenue diagram, does MR have to go? Oh, someone said that already. Go on to that. Can you draw perfectly elastic MC and AC in cost and revenue diagrams to save time? No, don't do that. Only do that if it's price discrimination. I would be flabbergasted if they ask about price discrimination, having asked it already as a 15 marker. But that's the only time that you would have done that. Yeah. Okay. So someone's asking, would you draw, for example, the monopoly versus perfect competition? Not really for the question that I was doing earlier. I don't think so. Like, as in, guys, by the way, the mark scheme's gonna have so many different points here. Like, as in, what I'm saying to you is like not some sort of gospel truth and the only answer. It's what I would recommend based on the fact that it's easier to develop. Simple points that you can develop in detail are always a big yes. Yeah. Can you answer 12 markers with 1 macro and 1 micro? If you choose, you can. I actually want you to do 1 analysis, 1 evaluation. Yeah. Don't do 2. Unless you have the time to do 2. For example, last year, the 22 paper had a question about increased integration in the food delivery market, right? That hopefully you guys know like that, where you simply go, okay, first analysis is they have more market share, draw AR and MR shifting out, talk about how they basically therefore have higher profits. Yeah. Second analysis is that they're a bigger firm, therefore they're able to tap into greater economies of scale, develop it. That's it. Even though that was actually, I didn't need to do 2. And then evaluate it by saying, oh, but actually the merger might result in diseconomies of scale. It might result in them having cultural clashes. They might not get on. Therefore, the merger may eventually end up with a demerger. Yeah. Okay, I will tell you guys what to do after in a second. Right, I'm going to quickly whiz through. Sorry, I keep reading them out loud. Let me just quickly whiz through some of the questions to see. Okay. Okay. Right. Someone's asking about, can we go through like the effectiveness of quantitative easing? Can I just, without like not answering the question, I will answer it. Yeah. The most important thing about quantitative easing is understanding what quantitative easing is. Because if you understand what quantitative easing is, the question becomes really straightforward. Quantitative easing, in a nutshell, and again, please watch my video on this if you haven't, it hopefully explains it quite well. Quantitative easing is where the Bank of England or the central bank in that country buys up illiquid assets like government bonds off commercial banks. Why are they doing that? Because it increases liquidity, and in a nutshell, it's to encourage the banks to reduce their interest rates. If I therefore said to you that the question, instead of it saying, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of quantitative easing, it said, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of low interest rates. Do you agree that is a ridiculously easy question now? That is the question. It is exactly the same question. I did it as the opposite a second ago, by the way. I did tight monetary policy, reverse my essay. Now hot money is going to flow out because interest rates are low. So therefore the supply of pounds will shift out. The currency will depreciate. We become more price competitive. Exports go up, imports go down. X minus M, happy days. Wow. Marshall Lerner, J-curve, crazy stuff, right? Consumption in that instance, because interest rates are low, will go up. Therefore, AR and MR for the firm are going to shift out. Profits are going to go up, woohoo, right? Etc. etc. It's just the opposite of the essay I did a second ago, yeah? So hopefully that answers your question. But essentially, quantitative easing, I feel like people really, really worry about what quantitative easing is. But if you just understand what it actually is, it's just interest rates. It's them trying to encourage the commercial banks to either reduce or raise their interest rates. In this case, quantitative easing is to reduce their interest rates. Yeah. If the question was about unwinding quantitative easing or the like reversing quantitative easing, it's just the opposite. It's going to cause interest rates to go up. And then it's my question that I did earlier. Yeah. Hopefully that's useful. Do we need to use the arguments or analysis that's provided in the source? Or can we use your own? You can use your own. Yeah. But I do think it's a good idea to try and incorporate some of the stuff that's in the data, not necessarily throughout every single point you make in the essay, but the data is typically quite helpful, by the way, for the 25 markers in paper 3. Like, so do use it. Yeah. All right, I'll tell you guys my advice and all of that. Right. Right. Okay, there's so many questions. I'm trying my best to keep up. Right. Right. Where can I find the 2021? There was no live stream for paper 3. The first time I ran a live stream was last year. So you guys are only my second year of live streams. It's useful. Yeah. Right. Can I make up a question, please? And then we will go through a few more things as well. So the question says the following. evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased monopsony power in the global market. 25 marks. So again, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased monopsony power in the global market. 25 marks. Right, I have done large chunks of this already earlier today, yeah? When you're planning this, you immediately go, okay, I can either look at it from the perspective of the supermarkets or the people that are exerting monopsony power, or from the perspective of the suppliers. I'm going to do both, but for my micro, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the supermarket because I can now draw the variable cost going down, yeah? The overarching point on a micro basis is that variable costs go down, therefore the profitability will go up, yeah? So you'd start off by saying one microeconomic effect of increased monopsony power is higher profits for the monopsonist or the monopsonists. You now explain that them being able to push down their prices, the prices they pay for their produce, translates into a decrease in their variable costs. You now shift MC and AC down, you draw the diagram, summarize the diagram, you're in happy land, right? We're amazing, yeah? The evaluation to that, it depends on the data, but it could be that actually they can't necessarily exert such power over large suppliers like Nestle, like Unilever, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, blah, blah, blah. So maybe the degree of monopsony power may be limited. Two, it could be the regulator could intervene, whether that's the domestic regulator like the CMA, or potentially the WTO might intervene and be like, whoa, 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 what are you doing, right? Or number three is that actually maybe the suppliers eventually start to merge with one another, which again can offset monopsony power. Now, which of those? It probably will be whichever's in the data or is alluded to in the data, that's the one I probably would do, yeah? If none of them are in the data, whatever you want, I don't mind. I feel like the macro side of this is a little bit more complicated, but again, there will be data to help you. But off the top of my head, if I were making up data for this, I would be looking at it now from the perspective of countries that rely on agricultural products. In other words, the primary product dependent economies like the Ivory Coast. If monopsony power is high, do you agree that, let's say, like chocolate manufacturing firms like Cadbury and Nestle, if they have a high degree of monopsony power, when they go to the cocoa farmers, they can dictate the prices to them. Therefore, the consequences of that is lower prices. Their export earnings therefore go down, right? X minus M is a component of AD. So if your export earnings are going down as an economy, AD is going to shift in. Economic growth is going to go down. Unemployment is going to go up, especially for those countries that are heavily reliant on primary products. They're going to suddenly see a big decrease in like growth rates. They're going to see a lot more unemployment. Loads of those farmers might have to now shut down, right? And then I could even talk about how the government might now collect less tax revenue, meaning that actually they have less money to invest into things like education, healthcare, probably mention both. And then you can wrap it up by saying this, therefore, may result in a fall in their HDI ranking, economic development down. Bear in mind, by the way, the overarching point then is one macroeconomic effect of increases in monopsony power is a fall in economic development in countries that are primary product dependent. That would be my topic sentence. Is that clear? The evaluations. Now, again, you don't need to evaluate micro with micro. You don't need to evaluate macro with macro. More often than not, it's logical to do so, so do it. But every now and then, that might be that it makes more sense to do something else. The one I'm going to do is a combination of both micro and macro. It's in both, yeah? Which is that the government might adopt or they may engage in something called fair trade schemes. Do you know what a fair trade scheme really is? A fair trade scheme is something that you learnt about hopefully in theme 1, which is a guaranteed minimum price scheme. As a means of protecting the farmers, it ensures that it's illegal for any farmer to sell below a certain price. And it's illegal, therefore, for firms to actually be able to get, as in like the Nestle or whoever it is that's buying it, they can't now buy it off you below that price because everyone is selling it at that price. You can now draw this. You can draw a very simple minimum price scheme diagram, or a guaranteed minimum price scheme, actually. Yeah. D1, this is QE, this is PE. If you remember from theme 1, you basically now draw this is the min price. This is P min. And we have this as the quantity demanded. This is how much is supplied, QS. By the way, the way I did that, just in case that wasn't clear, is you see that price, it hits which curve? Which curve is that that's going downward? That's the demand curve, yeah? Hence why the demand at this price is this, the supply is over there. There is therefore excess supply of this amount. But because they're trying to preserve and protect the farmers, the government are going to pledge to buy up the excess supply at the minimum price. So there's something that I need to shade in. And what I will shade in is this, yeah? And that's government spending. Cool. So you could talk about that as a potential evaluation. Fair trade schemes might limit the extent of the damage that could be caused by monopsony power. Maybe they can't exert that much monopsony power over you. Yeah, something like that. Okay. Okay, right, let's do another question. I had something in mind, I've forgotten what I was going to do. Oh, I know what I'm doing. Yeah, all right, you ready? Question is this: evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a fall in oil prices, or it could be a rise, by the way. In fact, let's do rise, because that's more topical now, yeah? So evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of an increase in oil prices. 25 marks. Remember, I said that for the micro, I want you, wherever possible, to bring it to a cost and revenue diagram. You bring it to cost and revenue diagram, and you're in happy land. Like, it's amazing. It's going to score really highly, yeah? So what is oil for the majority of firms around the world, especially like manufacturing industries? Well, oil is clearly a cost of production. Therefore, if oil prices are going up, as they are right now, because they're like the Ukraine-Russia war, right? What does that do to your variable cost? Well, it skyrockets your variable cost, right? So the analysis would be that profits are going to go down. Very quickly, let's draw it. We're going to do this. MC1, AR1 equals D1, MR1, Q1, P1, and here we go, C1. Okay, right. This is the bit that hopefully you are very comfortable getting to. If you're not, you need to practice. You really need to draw these properly, yeah? Okay, I just said that the oil prices are going up. That is a variable cost. It will impact each unit of production. And so therefore, MC and AC are likely to go up, starting with MC going up like this. Profit maximization occurs here. Quantity is going to go down to P2. P2, and then I'm going to shift the AC curve. I'm going to exaggerate my AC a little bit, by the way. I wanted to make a loss. It didn't need to. If your AC curve, when you shift it, continues to make supernormal profit, it will still be lower supernormal profit, but it's completely fine. So you go up from Q2, C2, and this is D, and this is E, okay? So clearly supernormal profits have now fallen. You basically can describe how some firms will need to shut down because maybe for them, the AR might now be less than their average variable cost. So it's going to be less than, yeah? Evaluation, right. The evaluation is to question whether actually all firms use that much oil. You could question that by talking about, well, actually, industries that are service-based, for example, they may not use that much oil. They're not as oil intensive. The impact, therefore, is far more profound on industries like the manufacturing sector, less so on other industries of the economy, like financial services, okay? So you can question that. You can also talk about how maybe other costs are falling. So even though the price of oil might be high, it might not necessarily be the end of the world for the firm because they might have lower costs. Maybe their productivity levels have gone up, or maybe whatever, the data might have something that you could use to explain why profitability might not be going down, okay? Right, let's do the macro side of things. The macro side of things, I actually think it depends on the wording of the question or which country they're dealing with. If they're looking at it through the lens of a country that is a net exporter of oil, well, in that instance, this is actually a good thing for them, right? If you're a net exporter of oil, so like Saudi Arabia as an example, yeah? Think about what happens when the price of commodities like oil go up. Do you agree that the PED for commodities like oil is very, very inelastic? People rely on oil and they use oil on a daily basis. Therefore, if the price of oil has gone up, yes, demand will go down. Of course it will. However, if it's inelastic, demand is not very reactive. In other words, 2 arrows next to price. So the revenue is, can you see it's going up, yeah? Okay. If you suddenly, therefore, are generating more money, your export earnings for Saudi Arabia are going up. X minus M means their current account balance is improving. X minus M is also a component of AD. Therefore, AD will shift outwards. Exports are also an injection into the circular flow of income, and so there'll be a positive multiplier effect. You draw your LRAS AD diagram and shift out your AD curve 2 times, and you just summarize that diagram and you got yourself a lovely paragraph that didn't require that much thinking. It was easy peasy. Nice and easy, simple. That's it, right? Let's evaluate in terms of like what you could potentially talk about. Well, if you're really stuck, by the way, a really easy thing to always talk about when it comes to like oil prices is that they're very volatile. But I think a pretty clever thing to talk about here is that the PED for oil might start to become more elastic over the next coming years because of the fact that more people are starting to switch to things like electric cars, but also because of alternative forms of energy like fracking, shale gas, etc. Again, the data might be really helpful on that in that regard. And this all therefore translates into potentially that their revenue might start to go down. They might not actually experience an increase in their export earnings if the demand for it might become more elastic. people might start switching to substitutes, basically. Okay, there you go. 25 out of 25. Yeah, obviously do the judgment as well. Right. Let's do another question. I did Monopsony. I did Monopsony as a 25 marker. Right. So let's do the labor market. I think the labor market is more probable this year as like an 8 or a 5, maybe as a 12. It could be a 25 marker, but it was asked as a 25 marker last year. The 25 marker though covers a lot of things that I want to kind of discuss. So let's deal with that as our question. Yeah. 25 marker in a nutshell said something along the lines of evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a higher minimum wage or an increase in or an introduction of the living wage. Yeah. Let's deal with it. Right. Clearly, the micro is easier than the macro. So let's start with the micro. On a micro level, I've drawn this diagram a billion times today, so I'm going to draw it again. You guys can definitely draw it. But on a micro level, what's going to happen to firms' profits if there's an increase in the wages they have to pay their workers? Sorry, profits down. Right. You literally that's the kind of overarching summary. You go one macroeconomic effect of an introduction of the living wage is firms' profits may decrease. You now quote from the data in terms of what the costs are going to, what's going to do to the costs. It will say something along that, like that. You can define the living wage. The living wage basically is a top up on the minimum wage. Yeah. It's basically paid. It used to be above the age of 25. I read an extract today actually, and it was about 23 now. Yeah. I think it was last year's paper actually. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, it therefore increases the variable cost of the firms. Labor, by the way, is a variable cost. The Marx scheme will allow you to argue that it's a fixed cost, but technically the correct thing is to say it's a variable cost. So do it. Variable cost translates into both MC and AC going up. Draw it, summarize it, easy peasy. Some firms might shut down. Wow. Yeah. EVAC. By the way, do you notice how repetitive this is? Like we keep going back to the same stuff over and over again. Paper 3 should hopefully be more straightforward than papers 1 and 2. The evaluation to that, evaluation you can talk about is, well, they might switch to younger workers, in which case it has no impact on their profitability. It might be that they switch to capital machinery like self-checkout machines, again, no impact on profitability. Or actually worker productivity levels might end up going up because of the opportunity cost of losing their job now being higher. Cool? So that's the evaluation. This is micro. On a macro level. On a macro level, you can do one of two things. You can either talk about higher living wage, means that people have more disposable income, and therefore they will consume more in the economy. Consumption is a component of AD. AD will shift out and all of that. Totally don't mind. That's actually very valid. Probably would actually do that. I mean, they'll tell you the other alternative as well. The other alternative is to talk about how higher living wage may deter FDI. TNCs might be like, no, thank you, not interested, don't want to come here. And therefore you could use that as analysis. But there's one more that I've just thought of that I just want to go through to make sure that you guys know the theory. What is the point of this? The point of this is to preserve or to protect the workers who are on low wages. Yeah, the individuals who are most likely to be exploited by the firms, and therefore you could argue that the living wage decreases income inequality. What am I going to draw? I'm going to draw a Lorenz curve. Let's draw it. We're going to have cumulative share of income, and that's as a percentage, and over here cumulative share of population. Right, I'm running out of space, I'm going to call it pop. Right, to remind you guys, those of you that watched the theme, the paper 2 revision course or the Q&A, the first thing that you draw after you do these axes is you draw a 45-degree line. That is the line of absolute equality. Okay, line of absolute equality. If this were the reality, every single person within the economy would have the exact same share of income, which is obviously not realistic. And therefore the reality is something like this, where the further away we are from that 45-degree line, the more unequal the society is. Okay, in my question or in my analysis here, I was saying, look, increasing the living wage helps to decrease income inequality because you're protecting the low-skilled workers and you're protecting people who are earning the least amount and bumping up their wages. Therefore, what you can now draw is it shifting inwards like that. Make sure you do the arrow to point in that direction to show that inequality has therefore fallen and the Gini coefficient has got closer to 0. It falls, yeah? If it's 0, it's perfect equality. If it's 1 looks like an eye, it's perfect inequality or absolute inequality. That's a pretty good analysis as well, by the way. Don't mind. That would work quite well, yeah? So that would be the analysis. Evaluation, I think the evaluation here, if I'm doing the inequality point, is that actually it may massively backfire. That the people that you're trying to protect may end up being the people that are most harmed by the living wage. Why? Because if it incentivizes firms to switch to capital machinery, those individuals are going to be displaced by the capital, and therefore there is going to be structural unemployment in the economy. If supermarkets look at the wages being paid to cashiers and decide, you know what, it's too high now, let's go and invest a lot more of our money into self-checkout machines, all of the cashiers that you were basically trying to protect as the government have now lost their jobs. They are now structurally unemployed. So, by the way, you could argue is government failure. So the government intervention in that market resulted in actually negative consequences for the people that they were intended to protect. Yeah, that would be one potential evaluation. Can I give you one last evaluation that we could have done as well? Is on a macro level, let's do this. So if I was talking about how high oil prices, actually it's more of analysis, sorry, can I actually do one more point though? Is I could have also spoken about it from the perspective of a country that is importing oil, right? So I would be like, here's price level, real output. If you're importing oil, what is happening to your cost of production? Well, obviously it's going up. So therefore SRAS would shift inwards. This is really problematic for an economy like the UK right now, and Germany, they have high inflation too, because you already have high inflation. And so it would result in even more inflation, like cost push inflation. Just food for thought, things for you guys to consider, and obviously reference based on the data and your vast knowledge of economics now. Right, can I do one more 25 marker, right? I will do my best to answer any other questions as well, but we are slightly going over time. I will stick around for a little bit more. 25 marker says the following: evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased globalization. So evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased globalization. 25 marks. Ready? In no particular order, just because it's kind of come into my mind in this way. You would obviously sit down and do a plan, and then you'd figure out which is the better point to do and start with that. But in my mind right now, I have a point that I'm worried I might forget, so I'll quickly do it, which is micro, yeah? So from a micro perspective, one of the things about globalization is that it should result in your costs going down as a firm. Why? Because if I'm able to now import goods like raw materials without there being a tariff, there is no tax, there is no like limit on what I can import in terms of quotas, my costs therefore are going to go down. True? Therefore, I can draw MC and AC falling, and I illustrate variable cost therefore decreasing and profitability going up. We've done this a billion times today. So hopefully you're really clear on what I'm expecting of you in terms of this diagram, yeah? So you could say one impact of globalization is higher profits for firms. By the way, the alternative is also that globalization means that you're more integrated into the global community, so you can sell your goods more easily in the global market. So I could easily have shifted out AR and MR. Quite like that, to be honest. Both are good. I don't mind. Whichever one you want, they're both excellent, because globalization means that firms can sell their goods more freely around the world, but it also means that their cost of production could also be going down. All of this basically goes back to profits should be going up for the firm. Let's evaluate. And the evaluation is really good here. It is that actually, especially in developing countries, globalization is likely to result in small domestic firms being pushed out of the market. That rather than their profits going up, their profits are likely to go down. Why? Because if TNCs now come and establish themselves in your economy, do you agree that TNCs are in a position to be able to tap into vast economies of scale? They can tap into and bulk buy, let's say, like their steel to produce their cars in such quantity. Can domestic small firms, especially in developing countries, compete against them? The answer is a definitive no. Therefore, those firms get pushed out of the market, and the TNC now establishes itself as a monopoly, which is not good. Yeah? Micro, macro. Trade liberalization is globalization. So therefore, you can do one of two things. You can either start by talking about how globalization would enable countries to be able to generate export-led growth. If you basically have trade agreements with other countries, like your main trading partners, you might be part of a trading bloc as an example, then you can trade more easily. As a result, export earnings are likely to go up. X minus M is a component of AD. Check that out. Injection, multiplier, blah, 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 blah. You guys are probably bored of me repeating this over and over again, but hopefully you're realizing that very, very repetitive when it comes to paper 3. There's the same chains of reasoning keep coming up over and over again, yeah? An alternative thing that I could have done, by the way, on a macro level is to talk about how actually a globalization has resulted in more FDI, and TNCs might come into your economy and improve the infrastructure.
if a TNC improves, let's say, the infrastructure because it makes their life easier, firms within the country now benefit from external economies of scale. So I know that's a macro concept. I'm going to bring it back to macro in a second, but no problem. So you go, they can tap into or they can take advantage of external economies of scale because they can now use that infrastructure themselves. The ending of that point, though, is that TNCs coming into your economy translates into LRAS shifting outwards. And you draw the LRAS curve shifting out, it could therefore lead to economic development in a developing country or just an increase in the productive capacity of an economy like the UK. I could, by the way, also be speaking about how globalization, because TNCs are coming in, FDI is coming in, it could translate into more tax revenue for the government, and you can go down that route, yeah? Eval, by the way, I just thought of a pretty good evaluation for globalization generally, which is to say that actually globalization results in environmental degradation, and you can draw a negative externality diagram. It is bad because of the amount of like goods and services or goods being transported from one country to the next, the number of people that are going on holiday, the number of people that are basically consuming pollutant things or things that are bad for you. So you could draw the following. Negative externality, cost/benefits. Negative externality, as hopefully you know, there is also a video on this, is negative is two cost curves, but I'm not going to label them just yet. One downward sloping curve, the benefit line, well, that's marginal private benefit. That's equal to marginal social benefit. You then dot down from the 2 points of intersection. And you always ask yourself the following: a negative externality, is that where we are doing too little of something or too much of something? Well, clearly, negative is doing too much. So which one's equilibrium? Number one or number two? Which one do you think logically represents doing too much? Obviously, this one. This is therefore QE. This we're going to call QSO to represent social optimum. This is PE. This is PSO. Okay? We now put our pen on the equilibrium. Okay? And this, therefore, is marginal private cost. Has to be, by the way, the equilibrium always occurs where private cost equals private benefit. And this is marginal social cost. We then draw the welfare loss triangle. Okay? Very, very easy point that you could do. Okay. Really quickly, actually, because that reminds me of something that I just want to really quickly show you without going through the entirety of the answer, because it's a very straightforward 25 marker. But in the 2018 paper, which was such a nice year, I think they were so nice in 2018, they decided to take out their like vengeance on everyone the next year in 2019. But in 2018, it was such a nice paper. Right. 25 marker, I want to show you guys, is this one. With reference to the information provided in your own knowledge, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of increased UK demand for coffee at branded coffee shops. Okay, cool. It's not to go through this question because this is fairly straightforward. So obviously for micro, you're shifting out AR and MR, summarizing it, profitability goes up, all of that, yeah? But to understand that previous questions are often hints. Previous questions should get you to think along the lines of how you might analyze or evaluate the 25 marker. Similarly, 8 markers might be relevant to the 12 or 5 marker. They interconnect, not always, but usually they do. And the 12 marker here, so the 8 marker here was this. Examine the advantages of using an indirect tax as a means of reducing the use of disposable coffee cups. There's a whole extract about how the coffee industry is highly pollutant because people are constantly using disposable cups and they are very difficult to recycle. I'm therefore answering this question about increased demand. My analysis is great for the firms in terms of profitability. It's great because they're going to generate more money. My evaluation on a micro level is a negative externality though. And the clue was that question. This is what I need you guys to realize, is that there are hints in questions that you can then use in other parts of your answers, yeah? Okay, so I would have basically done a negative externality to answer that particular evaluation. You didn't have to, there are other things that you could have talked about, but I think that works quite well. Right, let me read, there are 63 questions on Zoom. I will do my best to answer what I can do. Will you lose marks in an essay if you write an extra point which isn't as developed instead of writing less? No, there's no negative marking. I prefer you to write more. Obviously, think about what you're writing and obviously try to develop it in a way that's actually correct. But you are, the 25 marker in particular, I need you guys to provide a lot of depth. I need you guys to try and develop it in as much depth as you possibly can. I am in a moment going to speak about timing and, you know, making sure this is the most time-critical exam you'll ever see. Like this will, your hand is going to break on Monday. I said this ahead of paper 1 and paper 2. This is like another level, like I don't like Super Saiyan. Like it's your hand is going to kill. So we'll discuss timing in a second. Can you go over the labor market, specifically the elasticities, demand and supply of labor? I have done that in my paper 1 Q&A. So please watch that video. I did that in a lot of detail in the event that it would come up for paper 1. please watch that video. It will go through it in a lot of detail. Yeah. Right. What about when quantitative easing is used when interest rates are already cut low? I mean, normally it is like a second resort. They don't normally do quantitative easing unless interest rates are already cut. So a very good evaluation there, by the way, on a macro level, is to talk about how actually it might not even work. It might be that they suffer from this concept known as a liquidity trap, whereby if commercial banks have cut their interest rates as low as they are already willing to go, they may not be willing to cut their interest rates any lower. So if you adopt quantitative easing and buy their illiquid asset, the commercial banks might be like, oh, thank you very much. Thanks for buying my illiquid assets. I'm still not going to reduce my interest rates. I don't care. I'm not going to reduce my interest rates below a certain level because for me, that is as low as I'm willing to go. I'm not willing to lend out to individuals that might not pay it back. And why would I offer interest of, let's say, 1% to a business or a firm when I can offer that to the government? I can, like, for example, buy a government bond and get a return of, let's say, 2%. Who's safer, the government or an individual? Obviously, the government. Therefore, commercial banks may reach a point where they are unwilling to cut their interest rates any lower than they've gone. Cool? Just something to think about. Right. What caused the housing bubble, financial crisis? Okay, I'll post that video. It will really clearly explain it, by the way. So as soon as I upload this video, there'll be a comment underneath it about the financial crisis that I would recommend all of you guys to watch that video. It's a great video. Yeah. For the question on advertising, can we talk about effects on both cost and revenue? Yeah, I mean, it depends on how many marks. If it's 12, no, just talk about revenue. Yeah. If it was the case that, let's say, the question I just showed you guys a second ago about increased demand for coffee, when I shift out AR and MR, more often than not, you end up in a scenario where you will see your average cost is decreasing. Now, in a 25 marker, that's an excellent kind of thing to happen, because then I could talk about the fact that they're a bigger firm, like the coffee shop is a bigger firm, means that they can tap into greater economies of scale. And the diagram is not showing that because the cost is going down. Yeah. And I can give an example of what they can bulk buy now, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. Right. I will just quickly whiz through some of these stuff. Right, I apologize. I'm going to try my best to answer as many of these as I can, but there are a lot of questions. Right. Just to clarify again, you can use micro to evaluate the macro point, and you can use macro to evaluate the micro. It's rare that I would do that. More often than not, it's a lot more logical to just evaluate micro with micro and macro with macro, but you can. As long as you satisfy the condition of one analysis in detail on micro, one analysis in detail on macro, you are gravy. You're good. Yeah. Every 25 marker, by the way, every 25 marker, you must do that. You cannot just write about micro and you don't just write about macro. You have to do both. Yeah. Where are the rest of the vids? On our YouTube channel. So if you look at the YouTube channel, you'll be able to find it. All right, what's my opinion on these papers? I mean, doesn't matter. My opinion is irrelevant. Right, brother, I love you. Thank you. That's very nice of you. Right. What YouTube name? Expert Tuition. If you go on if you Google Expert Tuition, you'll be able to find loads of our videos. There's protectionism, like tariffs, and a couple of videos. There's not that many. I'm going to try and upload more. Probably not ahead of your Monday exam. Not gonna lie to you guys, but like, anyways. Right. Okay, cool. Let me have a load. Okay. What is the difference between TNC and MNC? Same thing. It's just the different name. TNC is transnational corporation. MNC is multinational corporation. It is literally the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Right. Hi. Let's chat ahead of Monday to make sure that you guys go there and absolutely obliterate this exam. The most important thing to understand about your exam on Monday is that it is going to be so time pressured. Therefore, you need to stick religiously to the timings that I set out. I will put together an Instagram post specifically for paper 3. We did it for paper 1 and for paper 2. It is slightly different for paper 3. Yeah. Where what I would do if I were you is I would go and open the paper. Don't even look at the second question. Just forget it's even there for now. Open and look at the first question. There is a 5 marker, there is an 8 marker, a 12 marker, and a choice of 25 markers. You should, from reading the questions, know which 25 marker you feel more comfortable answering. You should normally know what the answer is to a large extent already without the data, but it's okay if you don't, right? Don't freak out. If you look at the 25 marker and go, not that certain, the data is going to help. What you now do is you look at the 25, you look at the 12, and I probably look at the 8 as well. In my mind, I now have 3 questions that I know what they've asked and I know what I'm looking for. 3 highlighters that you take with you into the exam. One is your 25 marker highlighter, one is your 12 marker, and one is your 8 marker. Take your time and read and digest the data. Do not skim read the data. properly absorb the data and highlight, by the way, the appropriate things so that you very quickly can use that to reference. And for the 25 as well, by the way. Yeah. So if you do that, it means that when you get to the point where you're actually writing your answers for the questions, you can write it at like electric speed, like as fast as you can. 5 markers, more often than not, every now and then they ask some awkward, weird questions, but more often than not are really straightforward for the paper 3. Last year's 5 marker, for example, had a question about the Lewis model. As long as you knew what that was, pretty straightforward. I think it had a 5 marker as well about what kind of market structure it was in the kind of food delivery service. Again, really straightforward. I don't think they'll ask that again because they asked that for you guys in paper 1, but you never know, right? So the 5 marker should not take you more than 3 to 4 minutes to answer and get 5 out of 5. If you hit 5 minutes and you have not finished writing your answer for the 5 marker, you stop. I don't care what you've written at that point. Stop. Even if you're midway through it, just stop, right? It's not worth it. It's not worth getting like an extra mark. Drop it, leave it. If you've got time at the end, you won't. But if you have time at the end, you come back to it. Go to the 8 marker now, yeah? The 8 marker, I did so many things ahead of the paper 1 and paper 2 exams. I want you guys to just go over again. For example, in the paper 2 course, I did a whole thing about like the paper 3 question on Turkey, the Turkish central bank intervening, or why actually, sorry, depreciations were really bad for them, yeah? I need you guys to understand the 8 marker and the 5 marker are non-subjective. What I mean by that is when they mark it, it's just ticking boxes. It's ticking it as like, it's like bullet points. So you're gonna go, for the 8 marker, you're gonna go analysis number 1, knowledge mark, it's the first point, yeah? In fact, can I show you guys a question just so that it's easier to understand this, yeah? Give me a second. I want to show you an 8 marker and show you how easily we can answer this 8 marker in as few steps as humanly possible and get 8 out of 8. Yeah. I mean, this one, yeah, you know what? Let's do this one. Actually, I want to show one slightly different one. This will cause a lot of problems, actually. So let's deal with this one. Right. 8 marker. With reference to figures 4 and 5 in your own knowledge, examine the relationship between the fiscal deficit, between the national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit. People madly freaked out at this question when they sat this in 2017. They're like, oh my days. I need you guys to understand that part of this exam is almost like a mental exercise of like just not being like broken by the exam, just persevering. You can pick up marks just simply by doing 4 things here. You should be minimum getting 4 out of 8, minimum. Do you know how to define a fiscal deficit? If you don't, you need to know how to define a fiscal deficit. That's your first mark. Do you know how to define national debt? You should. Therefore, that's your second mark. Those are your 2 knowledge marks. Do you know how to read data from a figure? Obviously you do. You're not an idiot, right? You literally can look at that and go, oh, wow, it's going up, right? And quote the numbers. Do you know how to quote figure 5? Yes, you do, right? Can I show you guys how I would write this 8 marker almost like, and it shouldn't take more than 6 minutes to get 8 marks. First thing I do is, I know by the way, they've done it on purpose. Their question is awkwardly worded, where they've done national debt as a percentage of GDP, and then the fiscal deficit. And notice, by the way, the figures are done in that way as well, where national debt comes first, and then fiscal deficit. But that's kind of illogical, because fiscal deficit, it makes sense to define that first and national debt. Therefore, just tell them to do one and go, all right, your starting point is define a fiscal deficit. That is your knowledge mark. It would be a fiscal deficit is where government spending exceeds tax revenue in 1 year. 1 mark. Let's count with me, yeah? Let's get our marks. The next thing I would do is immediately now quote from the figure. According to figure 5, I would do the same period of time, by the way, when I'm referencing, because I'm comparing the 2 figures. According to figure 5, the UK's fiscal deficit rose from approximately £40 billion in 2007 to approximately £158 billion in 2009. By the way, don't fall for this. A lot of people said that the deficit fell because they see the number going down, but it's a negative number. Look, it's below 0. So a negative number becoming more negative means it's rising, it's increasing. I know they did that again to like throw you off. So you go, fiscal deficit is that's 1 mark. My application mark was quoting the numbers. I leave a line now, by the way, yeah, because the question was wanting me to look at the relationship. So I'm going to do that at the end. That's my first paragraph. It's literally 2 lines, yeah. I now leave a line and go, national debt is the accumulation of all the unpaid fiscal deficits up to that point in time. That's my knowledge mark, right? It's my second knowledge mark, by the way. I now quote the figure 4, and I would do the exact same date range that I just did for figure 5. According to figure 4, the UK national debt as a percentage of GDP rose from approximately, what are we calling that, like 38% in 2000, and well, you guys can look at it more clearly on a piece of paper, 38% in 2007 to approximately 60%, 60% in 2009. How many marks have I got? 4. Do you agree that required practically 0 brain power to get the 4 marks? And in the worst case scenario, if you get 4 out of 8, I'm not crying over that. It's okay. Don't worry. Yeah, like, as in you will accumulate the marks elsewhere. You'll be able to smash. For example, the 12 marker is absolutely jokes here. It's discussed the impact of living wage on profitability of firms. You're getting 12 out of 12 now. I refuse for you to get less. You're drawing cost and revenue diagram and talking about variable costs going up. You're going to quote the extract talking about costs going up. You're going to say profitability is going to go down. You're going to evaluate it with, oh, they could switch to younger workers. Good for you for your 12 out of 12. Anyways, here, 4 marks analysis. How do I get the other 2 marks? Well, the question is asking about the relationship between these 2 things. It's a relationship. The relationship is obviously positive. So you basically say that, as such, this indicates that there's a positive correlation between the UK's fiscal deficit and national debt as a percentage of GDP. How many marks have I just got? 6 marks. Did that take 6 minutes? Not even remotely close to 6 minutes. I need you guys to understand that 8 markers are marked in that way. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. So the 2 marks here were just answering the question. Just answer it. Just make sure you answer the question. The 2 marks of evaluation, I would only want you to do 1 evaluation, by the way, that you explain, not enormous amounts of detail, but you can explain it. If you're super stuck, can I teach you guys the lamest evaluation that you're only allowed to do for an 8 marker, nothing else? And especially if it has something like this. Can you see that over here we have a forecast? If you're super stuck, you're like, oh my goodness, I have no evaluations. I don't know what to think of as an evaluation here. You can go, however, from 2015 onwards, that relationship may not hold as the data may be inaccurate since it's a forecast. Lame. I know, it's so lame, right? But it's on the mark scheme, and it will always be on the mark scheme for an 8 marker. Yeah. I think there's a really clever evaluation though for this one. So I want to just like work through that one with you guys. Look really carefully at the wording of the question. So the wording of the question was, examine the relationship between the national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit. Notice that one of the variables is expressed as a proportion of GDP, whereas the other is not. Therefore, a very clever thing to say here is, however, the relationship may not always hold, because figure 4 is expressed as a percentage of GDP, whereas figure 5 is not. Therefore, if the GDP, for example, were to go down, national debt as a percentage of GDP would rise, even if the fiscal deficit had not risen. That is really good, right? That's a really clever evaluation that you could do. Other things, by the way, generically for like 8 markers are like short run, long run, like it just might be a temporary thing. If it's like about the impact of like oil prices going up or down, or it just might be temporary, like oil prices might go back up again, or they might go down again, or the government might intervene and limit the extent of like whatever, like really, really, really rubbish evals for 8 markers typically will pick up the marks. They're like generic stuff, like magnitude. Oh, it depends how big the change was. Yeah. Anyways, my point then is the 8 marker, you should never exceed 8 minutes, maximum 8 minutes. I actually don't think you should exceed 6 minutes to do it, but you should get no more than 8 minutes. The 12 marker, especially if you're doing it as 1-on-1. Now, if you guys are lucky enough that you get a cost and revenue diagram for one of your points, I hope you do, yeah? And hopefully it's a 12. Sometimes they do it as an 8, which is annoying. If it is an 8, by the way, it's just one analysis. It's just the diagram and explanation. And if it's a 12, also just one analysis. Could you describe the diagram? That question you can take up to 15 minutes for, including the planning, yeah? But again, ideally, if it's a nice question like this one, you should not need the full 12 minutes. You're writing quickly. This, I genuinely reckon you can get all of the marks in 9 minutes. All of it, yeah? That gives you a bit more time for the 25 marker. I will lay out in terms of the 25 markers, the exact timings. We'll post something on Instagram and you guys can look at that. But with the 25 marker, by the way, please make sure you plan it. Don't just jump into it. You will very easily get into a position where you start to like second guess yourself or make it a lot more difficult for yourself. Make sure you have done a plan. You go, this is my micro point. This is my macro point. This is what I'm going to evaluate. Just really quickly, like just bullet points. And then obviously know what data you're going to use from the extract as well to kind of guide you and influence you in terms of answering the question. Okay, right. Let me see just a couple of other questions. Right, let's see all the questions here. It says 89 questions. I can't see 89 questions there. Right, hopefully that was helpful. I really apologize if there are questions that you guys asked that I wasn't able to go through, or just time didn't like permit us to go through it. I hope you guys do incredibly well. I'm rooting for all of you guys. Hopefully these lives in the last couple of weeks have been helpful. Please tell your friends, and yeah, feel free to utilize our resources and both on the website as well as our YouTube channel as well. And yeah, good luck for Monday. I hope you guys do really